Good evening and welcome back. Tonight we are going somewhere quiet. We are going inside a single house, in a single glen, on a single evening, in a year that is more or less the middle of the 18th century, and we are going to spend the whole of the evening there. As always, I'd love to know where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it for you? And if you enjoy these cozy journeys through history, consider subscribing so you don't miss the next one. Whether you're here to drift into sleep or to follow the currents of history, I'm glad you're with me. We are not going to leave. We are simply going to sit somewhere quiet in the corner of the room, and we are going to watch the evening pass. The fire will burn. The wind will move against the outside of the walls. The household in its unhurried way will do what households of this kind have done for generations on evenings of this kind, and we will be there, in the room. While it does it, the year is 1745. The place is a glen on the western side of the Scottish Highlands, somewhere between the inner sea and the high ground. The light as we begin has been failing for some time. It is the late afternoon of a day in the autumn, perhaps the early evening, perhaps a little later. The exact day does not matter. The light is what we have to go by, and the light is the light of a Highland autumn at the hour when it is no longer afternoon and not yet quite night. The hills above the glen, which are visible from the front of the house, are the colour of a wet brown wool, with the bracken in the lower parts already turned, and the heather above the bracken still holding the last of its purple, and the rocks above the heather grey and wet. The cloud is low over the tops of the hills. The air is cold, but not yet bitterly cold. There is no rain at this particular moment, although there has been rain earlier in the day, and the puddles in the track that runs past the front of the house still hold the sky. The house we are going to is a low, long building of stone, with a roof of thatch, set with its long side parallel to the slope of the hill behind it. It is one of perhaps a dozen houses of similar shape and size that make up the settlement of this glen, and the houses are arranged in no particular pattern, set down where the ground allowed them to be set down, with kitchen gardens between them, and enclosures of dry stone wall around the gardens, and the open hill rising directly behind. The settlement has been here for many generations. The ancestors of the people who live in these houses have been laying the same stones year after year for as long as any of them can remember. The houses, in their basic form, are the houses their grandparents lived in and their great-grandparents before them, and the differences between this generation and the last are differences of detail rather than of large arrangement. Our house, the particular house we are going to spend the evening in, is set toward the lower end of the settlement, near the burn that runs down through it. The burn, at this hour, is making a steady sound that the ear notices when the wind drops, and that the ear stops noticing when the wind picks up again. The burn has been making this sound, more or less, since long before any of the houses were built. It will go on making it long after we have gone home. The house itself is perhaps 30 feet long, and perhaps 15 feet wide. The walls are of stone gathered from the hill above, mortared with clay where mortar was needed, and standing about head height at the eaves where the thatch begins. The thatch is of heather, layered thick over the underlying timber, weighted with stones along the edges to keep the wind from lifting it, and rounded gently at the corners where the gables curve away from the wind. The whole building, seen from the outside, has the quality of something that has been pressed down into the ground by long use, of something that has settled into the place it stands in until it has become indistinguishable in its weathered colours. From the slope of the hill behind it, there is a low door in the long wall of the house, on the side that faces the burn. The door is made of rough boards, fitted together with iron nails, hung on iron hinges, and held closed against the wind by a wooden latch on the inside. There is no other door. There is no proper window in the wall, only a square opening, set high up under the eaves, with a piece of oiled cloth stretched across it that lets in a little dim light during the day and keeps out most of the rain. There is, near the centre of the long wall opposite the door, a hole in the thatch through which the smoke of the fire is supposed to find its way out, although in practice the smoke finds its way out through every gap and crevice of the building and the thatch above the fire, after generations of use, has been blackened on its underside until it is the colour of soot rather than of heather. We are going to the door now. We are walking along the track that runs from the burn up past the front of the house, with the grass underfoot wet from the day's rain and the smell of the peat smoke from the chimneys of all the houses in the settlement coming down to us on the wind that is moving along the glen. The smell is the principal smell of a Highland evening at this hour. It is a smell of burnt peat and damp wool and the cold air over wet ground, mixed with the smaller smells of the byre and the kitchen garden and the burn itself. The smell will be with us for the rest of the evening. The smell is, in some respects, the deepest signature of the place. Once it is in your clothes and in your hair, it stays for days. The people who live in this glen do not, on the whole, notice it. They have been smelling it since they were born. The smell is, for them, simply the smell of the world they inhabit. For us, who have come here from elsewhere, the smell is the most immediate evidence that we are no longer where we usually are. We have arrived at the door. The door is in front of us. There is no need to knock. The household knows we are coming. The hospitality of the Highlands in this period is by long tradition the most reliable feature of the place, and any traveller who arrives at the door of any house at any reasonable hour will be admitted, fed, warmed, and given somewhere to sleep without his having to ask. The traveller is not, on the whole, asked his business. The traveller is given what he needs. The transaction is the oldest transaction the place has, and it operates without much in the way of formal acknowledgement. We are travellers, we have come to the door. The door, when the latch is lifted from the inside by the woman of the house, who has heard our footstep on the threshold stone, opens inward and we step through. The first thing is the dimness. The light outside has been failing, but the light outside is still the daylight of the late afternoon. And even on a wet October evening, the daylight is brighter than the light inside the house. The eyes take a moment. The smell, which we already know from the outside, is now more intense, because the smoke is filling the space we have just entered, and the warm, wet air that the door has admitted us into is denser with it than the air outside has been. The eyes adjust. The eyes find their way. The room slowly assembles itself out of the dimness. The room is, as we already know from the outside, a long, low room. It has the dimensions of the building's exterior, minus the thickness of the walls, which is considerable. The floor is of beaten earth, packed hard by years of feet, with a layer of fresh rushes spread across it that has been brought in from the riverbank a few days ago, and that gives the floor a slightly springy quality underfoot. The walls inside are of the same stone we saw outside, unplastered, their crevices stuffed with moss and rags of cloth where the wind would otherwise come through. The roof, when the eyes look up, is a low arc of dark beams running from wall to wall, with the underside of the thatch dark above them, and the smoke from the fire rising up between them in curling shapes that the movements of the air inside the room shape into ribbons. The fire is the centre of everything. The fire is in the middle of the floor, on a low hearthstone, with no chimney above it, but only the hole in the thatch we noticed from outside. The fire is built of peat, the dried turf that the people of the glen have cut from the high ground above the settlement in the early summer and stacked in carefully arranged stacks near the doors of their houses for use through the rest of the year. The peats burn slowly. They burn with a steady red glow rather than with the tall yellow flame of a wood fire. They produce, instead of sparks and crackling, a thick low smoke that has the slightly resinous sweetness of the bog that the peat was cut from, and that fills the room with the smell that has been with us since we approached the door. Above the fire, hanging from a chain that descends from a beam above the hearth, is an iron kettle. The kettle is large. It is round-bottomed. It is blackened with the use of years. It has been in this house, by various accounts, longer than the woman of the house has been in it, and it since she came as a bride from a neighbouring glen many years ago. The kettle is, at this moment, holding a quantity of water that is not yet boiling, but is, by the steady plume of steam that is rising from its open top, on the way to boiling. The chain that holds the kettle is fitted with a series of links and hook that allow the kettle to be raised or lowered as the cooking requires, and the woman of the house, when she needs to adjust it, does so with a practiced motion that suggests she has been doing it every day of her adult life. We are still standing near the door. We have not moved into the room. The woman of the house, who has now finished latching the door behind us, gestures with a movement of her hand toward the side of the fire opposite where she is standing, and we understand that we are being shown to a place to sit. There is a low wooden bench against the wall on that side of the room. The bench is made of a single thick plank set on 2 stone supports. It has been polished by years of sitting to a smooth dark brown. There is a folded plaid laid across it as a kind of cushion, the wool of the plaid heavy and slightly oily and smelling, like everything else in the room, of peat smoke. We go to the bench. We sit. The bench is solid under us. The wall behind us is cold against the back, but the warmth of the fire reaches us at the front, and the wool of the plaid we have been given to put behind us takes up the warmth and holds it. This is where we will be for the rest of the evening. This corner of the room, this bench, this view of the fire and the kettle and the movement of the woman of the house as she goes about her work. Estes, let us look now more carefully at the room. The hearth, as we have said, is in the middle of the floor. The hearth is roughly square, made of flat stones set into the earth, with the burning peats arranged at the centre of it, and a ring of smaller stones around the outside to contain any embers that might roll. The hearth is the first thing that was laid down when this house was built, by some ancestor whose name no one in the present household knows, and the hearth is the thing that, when this house eventually falls down and is rebuilt or abandoned, will most likely outlast the rest of it, because hearthstones, when they have been used for long enough, take on a quality that is hard to describe but easy to recognize, and the people of the glen, when they walk over the ground where a long-abandoned house once stood, can still tell, by the colour and the arrangement of the stones, where the hearth was. To one side of the hearth, on the floor, is a low 3-legged stool. The stool is the woman of the house's working seat. It has been polished, like the bench we are sitting on, by years of use, and it has the particular slight tilt that all heavily used stools eventually develop, where one of the 3 legs has worn down a fraction more than the others. To the other side of the hearth is a longer arrangement, a kind of low wooden settle with arms, and a back large enough to seat 2 or 3 people, also worn smooth and dark, set with its open face toward the fire. This is the settle of the household. The man of the house, when he is in the room, sits there. The older children sit there beside him. The whole arrangement of seating around the hearth is not formal in the way that a more elaborate household might be formal, but it is consistent. Everyone in the household has their own place. The places have not been assigned. The places have, over the years, simply settled themselves into the customs of the room, and the customs are now strong enough that the places are observed without anyone having to think about them. Against the long wall opposite the door, in the section of the room that is furthest from the entrance, is a large wooden chest. The chest is made of pine, with iron strapping at the corners, and a heavy lock on the front that is, more or less, decorative, because the chest is rarely locked. Inside the chest are the household's principal stores of cloth, of clothing not currently in use, of the treasures that the family has accumulated over the generations, of the family's papers, if any of them know how to read, which in this household 2 of them do, and of the private things that each member of the family is allowed to keep there in a space of their own. The chest has been in the house for nearly 100 years. It was made by tradition by the great-grandfather of the present man of the house, who was a carpenter as well as a farmer, and who built the chest as part of the dowry of his eldest daughter, who in due course brought it back to her father's house when her own husband died young, and she returned to the place where she had been raised. The chest has been, since then, the household's largest single piece of furniture, and the history of the chest is itself one of the histories that the family tells when the conversation in the evening turns to the things that have been in the house longer than anyone living can remember. Along the long wall on the same side as the chest, but nearer the door, is a smaller arrangement. There is a wooden trestle table, not large, perhaps 4 feet long, set against the wall when it is not in use. The trestle is dismantled during the day and brought out at the evening meal. There are a few wooden bowls and wooden spoons stacked on a shelf above the trestle. There are a few earthenware crocks of various sizes lined up on the floor below it. There is a wooden barrel of meal that the woman of the house dips into for the meals, set near the trestle, with its lid kept on against the mice, although the mice, by long custom, are managing in any case, and no one in the household considers the matter worth pursuing. Along the short wall at the end of the room, opposite the byre end, there is a partition. The partition is made of vertical planks set into a frame, and it divides off a section of the room about 6 feet square. Behind the partition is the box bed. The box bed is the principal sleeping arrangement of the woman and the man of the house, and it is, in the cold of a Highland winter, one of the most carefully designed pieces of furniture in the house. It is, in essence, a wooden box with one open side, set against the wall, with a curtain of heavy wool across the open side that can be drawn at night. The bed inside the box is filled with heather and bracken, layered thick, with a woolen blanket and a heavy plaid above. The whole arrangement is, when the curtain is drawn, an enclosed space that holds the body's heat through the night. The children sleep on a similar arrangement on the other side of the partition, on a low platform built against the wall, with their own pile of heather and their own coverings. The infants, when there are any, sleep with the woman of the house in the box bed itself. At the other end of the room, at the door end, is the byre. The byre is a section of the room about 8 feet long that has been partitioned off with a low wooden screen, and that holds, on most evenings of the year, 2 or 3 of the household's animals. There are at this moment a single milk cow, a black cow with a white patch on her forehead, and a grey goat with a kid that was born in the spring and that is now nearly grown. The cow is standing at the rear of the byre, chewing her cud, her breath visible in the cold air on her side of the screen. The goat is lying down beside her. The kid is curled up against the goat's side. The animals are part of the household. They have been part of the household in their own succession of mothers and daughters for as long as the household itself has been here. The cow's mother lived in this byre. The goat is descended in the same way from goats that have been in this house through the lives of 3 or 4 generations of women. The animals, by their presence at this end of the room, contribute to the warmth of the building. The cow's body, in the cold of a winter night, gives off a steady, gentle heat that the room would otherwise lack. The cow has a name. The cow's mother, who lived in this byre before her, was called by a similar but slightly different name, and the cow's mother's mother, who lived in this byre before that, was called by a third related name, and the succession of related names, going back in the household's memory for about as long as anyone in the household can remember, marks the succession of cows that the household has had over the generations. The cow knows her name. The cow is, in the woman of the house's private estimation, a good cow, of even temperament, with a steady supply of good milk, and easy in her habits of allowing herself to be milked. The cow has, over the 12 years she has been in the byre, produced 11 calves. Several of the calves have been kept, and have in their own time been sold or eaten or kept on as the next generation. The most recent calf was born in the spring of this year, and was in due course sold on to a relative in a neighbouring glen for the price that the spring market for calves produced. The cow, having lost the calf, was for some weeks afterwards in a slightly altered state, with the low sounds at evening that mothers without their calves produce. But the cow, by the routine of her work and the patience of the household, settled back, after a few weeks, into her ordinary self. The goat does the same, on a smaller scale. The smell of the animals, the slightly sharp smell of cow, and the slightly sharper smell of goat is part of the larger smell of the room, and the woman of the house, who notices the smell less than we do, because she has been smelling it since she was a girl in her own father's house, considers the smell, on the whole, a virtue rather than a fault. A house with no animals, in this place and at this time, is a house without warmth. This is the room. This is what we have come to. We are on the bench. The fire is in front of us. The kettle is hanging above the fire. The woman of the house is on her low stool on the other side of the hearth, with her back partly toward us, her hands working on something we have not yet been able to see clearly. She is, we now see, working with wool. There is a basket beside her on the floor, made of woven willow withies, holding a quantity of unspun wool that has been carded already, white wool with darker grey streaks running through it, fluffed up into a loose pile. She has a distaff fastened to her belt, with a bunch of the carded wool tied to its top, and she has a hand spindle in her right hand that she is twirling between her fingers with a constant motion. The spindle is dropping slowly toward the floor as the thread it is spinning lengthens, and when the spindle reaches the floor, she will pick it up, wind the new thread onto it, set it spinning again, and the process will resume. This is one of the principal evening occupations of every woman in the glen at this season. There is a great deal of wool to be spun. The household needs cloth. The cloth is woven from the thread. The thread is spun from the wool. The wool, at this moment, is in the basket, and on the distaff, and in the hands of the woman of the house, who will, by the time the long evening is over, have produced perhaps 100 yards of new thread that will, in due course, contribute to the next length of plaid or the next blanket or the next set of stockings that someone in the household requires. She is not looking at her hands. She does not need to. The motion of the spinning, after the years she has been doing it, is automatic. She is looking at the fire. She is, occasionally, looking at us. She is, when she looks at us, smiling faintly, in the careful way of a woman who is not sure what to make of the strangers who have come to her house, but who is determined to behave correctly toward them. The woman of the house is perhaps 35 years old. She is slim. Her hair is dark, with the first threads of grey beginning at the temples, and is pinned up under a white linen cap that ties under her chin. She wears a long woolen gown of a dark blue colour, with a wool plaid wrapped around her shoulders and the upper part of her body, fastened at the front with a brass pin. The plaid is patterned in the dark blues and greens and reds of the cloth that her own mother taught her to weave, with the variations of pattern that mark out the cloth of one weaver from another. She is, in her dress, in no way remarkable. She is dressed as every other woman of her age in this glen is dressed, in the clothes that were made on the looms of the same houses she walks past every day on her way to the burn for water. She has been spinning since we came in. She will continue spinning, with pauses for the work of the meal, and the pauses for the conversation with us when we manage to make ourselves understood, until the fire is banked for the night and the household goes to bed. The spinning is not for her a particular task that has to be completed. The spinning is what her hands do in the evenings. The spinning is the texture of the time between supper and bed. There will be more wool to spin tomorrow and the day after that, and her hands will continue, in their constant motion, to turn the carded wool in the basket beside her into the thread that the household needs. The fire, while she is spinning, is doing its own work. The peats have been burning, by our reckoning, for perhaps an hour at the level we are seeing them now. The fire was brought back up from its banked state when the woman of the house began the preparations for the evening meal, and the peats that are now glowing red were placed on the hearth perhaps 3/4 of an hour ago. Peats, when they are well dried and properly stacked on the hearth, burn at a steady rate that makes them ideal for the kind of long, unattended cooking that the rhythms of a Highland kitchen require. A peat, once lit, will hold its red glow for 2 or 3 hours with accumulation of fine grey ash building up beneath it, and the woman of the house, when she needs to manage the heat of the fire, does so by the simple measure of moving the peats slightly closer together to concentrate the heat, or slightly further apart to disperse it. The smoke from the peats, as we have already noted, rises up through the room in curling columns. The columns of smoke, when the eye watches them, have a particular quality of movement that is in itself one of the principal soothing features of the room. The columns rise, they twist, they thicken, they thin. They are caught, occasionally, by the currents of air that move through the room when someone opens the door for a moment, or when the wind outside finds a particular crevice in the walls, and they are pushed sideways by the current, and then resume their upward movement when the current passes. The smoke, by the time it reaches the underside of the thatch, has lost its definite shape and become a kind of general haze that hangs in the upper part of the room, and that the hole in the thatch above the fire is gradually drawing out into the wider air. The hole in the thatch is not, on the whole, sufficient to draw all of the smoke out. A significant proportion of the smoke remains in the room, thickening the air, slightly stinging the eyes when the eye is unaccustomed to it, and contributing to the general dim quality of the light that we have been adjusting to since we came in. The woman of the house, who has been breathing this smoke for the whole of her life, does not appear to notice it. The eyes of the woman of the house are clear. The smoke is, for them, the air they breathe. The slight stinging quality that we are aware of, and that we will continue to be aware of for the next half hour or so, until our own eyes have begun to adjust, is something they do not feel at all. The fire, in addition to its smoke, gives off its light. The light of the fire is the principal light in the room at this hour. There is an additional light from the doorway, where the late afternoon sky outside is still slightly brighter than the inside of the room, and there is a still smaller light from the high window with its oiled cloth, through which a dim square of grey light is just visible. But the fire is the main source. The fire's light is red. The fire's light is unsteady. The fire's light wavers in movements as the peats settle, and as the currents of air in the room move across them, and the wavering of the light produces, on the walls and the ceiling of the room, a constant shifting of the shadows that the eye, after a few minutes, stops trying to follow. The walls of the room, as the eye becomes accustomed to the light, and as the details begin to be visible, are not the bare stone we first thought they were. There are things on the walls. The eye, slowly, begins to find these things and to recognize them. There is a length of dried fish, hanging from a peg driven into a crack between 2 stones on the wall near the byre end. There are several bundles of dried herbs, hanging from the rafters, the colours of them muted in the dim light to various greys and browns. There is a wooden spoon, hanging by a leather loop from another peg near the woman of the house's stool. There is a horn drinking cup, hanging from a 3rd peg. There is a dark object, near the chest at the far end of the room, that we cannot quite make out, and that we will, when we have a chance to look more closely, recognise as a leather bag that holds the household's salt. The salt is one of the more valuable things in the room. The household salt comes from a long way away, brought up the coast in the boats that work the Hebridean trade, and carried inland by the packmen who come through the glen 2 or 3 times a year. A pound of salt represents, in the household's economy, a substantial expense, and the leather bag is treated with the care that the expense requires. The salt is used sparingly for the curing of the meat and the fish, for the daily seasoning of the food, and for the few other purposes that the household has for it. The bag has been replenished from the packman's last visit, and the bag will need to last, by the woman of the house's careful calculation, until the next visit in the spring. These are the things on the walls. There are no pictures. There are no decorations beyond the functional pegs and the functional objects hanging from them. The walls are, in their basic character, working walls. They are built to keep out the cold and the wet. They are not built to be looked at. The fact that we are looking at them on this particular evening is more a feature of our own unfamiliarity with the room than of any quality the walls themselves possess. The household, which has been looking at these walls for most of its members' entire lives, no longer looks at them at all. There is, however, an additional source of light in the room that we have not yet described, and that we now begin to notice in the deeper dimness as the daylight from the door has fully receded. There is, set on a wooden bracket fixed to one of the upright timbers near the woman of the house's stool, an iron lamp of a kind that the people of the place call a cruisie. The cruisie is a flat iron bowl, with a shallow upper chamber that holds a quantity of fish oil and a wick of twisted rush that lies along one edge of the bowl with its end protruding. The wick has been lit, at some point in the early evening, from an ember of the fire, and the flame at the end of the wick gives off, in addition to the light of the fire, a steady additional flame of its own. The flame is yellow rather than red. The flame is small. The flame is, by its position on the bracket, throwing an additional patch of light onto the wall behind the woman's stool, and the wool that she is spinning, when it passes near her hands, catches the yellow light briefly and shows the fibres of the wool in a way that the firelight alone does not show them. The cruisie is the household's working light. The cruisie has been used in this room by various previous lamps of the same design since the room was built. The fish oil that fuels it is the rendered oil of sea fish that the household acquires from the coast in the autumn, brought up the glen by the same packmen who bring the salt, and the jar of the oil that supplies the cruisie is kept on a shelf above the bracket, with a wooden stopper to keep it from spilling. The cruisie will burn on a filling of the oil for perhaps 3 or 4 hours, and the woman of the house, when she fills it in the early evening, fills it with enough oil to last until the bedding down. The yellow flame of the cruisie is, in the room, the companion of the larger red light of the fire, and the two together, the red and the yellow, the central and the local, the larger general light and the smaller working light, are what the room has to see by until the household goes to bed. There is, in addition to the cruisie, on certain evenings when finer work is being done, the use of rushlights. The rushlights are not in use this evening, but the household keeps a bundle of them on a shelf above the woman of the house's stool, and on evenings when very fine sewing or very fine knitting is required, one of them will be lit and held in an iron holder near the work. The rushlights are made by the woman of the house herself in the late summer, from the rushes that grow in the wet ground near the burn. The rushes are gathered, peeled of their outer green skin, so that only a thin strip of the skin remains running down one side of the white inner pith, dried in the sun, and then, when fully dry, dipped in mutton fat that has been melted in a long iron pan over the fire. The rushes after the dipping are hung in bundles to harden. A single rushlight, properly made, will burn for perhaps half an hour with a steady flame that gives a clear light in a very area around it. The rushlights are the household's way of getting, when needed, a slightly brighter and steadier light than the cruisie provides, and the bundle on the shelf represents the woman of the house's evening work of one afternoon in the late summer, which will provide the household with finer light through the whole of the dark months, until the next year's bundle is made. The wind outside is changing. We can hear it. The sound of the wind, which has been a constant background since we came in, has shifted in its character over the last few minutes. The wind has been blowing up the glen from the direction of the inner sea, and it has been since we arrived a steady, moderate wind that produced a low, constant note in the ear, a kind of soft hum that the ear had stopped noticing because it had become part of the general fabric of the room's sound. The wind has now become a slightly stronger wind. The note has risen in pitch. The note has acquired an additional element of unsteadiness, a periodic gusting that breaks the steady hum into a series of softer hums and louder hums that follow each other without an obvious pattern. The woman of the house notices the wind. She looks up briefly from her spinning. She glances toward the door, although the door is closed and there is nothing to see. She looks back at her work. She returns to the steady motion of her hands. The wind in its new strength is not yet a wind that requires anyone in the room to do anything. The wind is for the moment simply a slightly stronger version of what it was before. If it grows further, in the course of the evening, the woman of the house may need to add an extra weight or two to the door to prevent it from rattling, and she may need to put another peat on the fire to compensate for the increased draft that a stronger wind would draw through the gaps in the walls. And these are the responses that the wind, in its various strengths, calls for. The wind has been blowing across this glen for as long as anyone can remember. The wind will continue to blow across this glen for as long as anyone can foresee. The wind is, like the burn outside the door, like the smell of the peat smoke, like the movement of the woman of the house's hands as she spins, one of the constants of the place. The household, which has been listening to the wind for as long as it has been in the house, listens to it without conscious attention. The wind is one of the things that, when the household is for any reason away from this house and in some other place, makes the household feel that it is not at home. The wind has been with us, in our description of the evening, since we approached the door. The wind will be with us for the rest of the evening. The wind is, in some respects, the longest sustained sound that the room contains, and the irregular gusts of it, as they move against the stone walls and the thatched roof of the building, are part of the rhythm by which the evening will, over the next several hours, slowly pass. The fire is burning, the kettle is steaming, the wool is being spun, the smoke is rising, the wind is moving around the building. The light in the room is the dim red light of the fire. The walls of the room are the dark stone of the hill above the settlement. The floor is the beaten earth of the room. The ceiling is the low arc of dark beams. The bench under us is solid. The plaid behind our back is warm. The whole of the room is, in its quiet way, settling into the long evening that is now beginning. We are here. We have nowhere else to be. There is now a change in the texture of the room. The change is not large. The change is the change that occurs in any house, in the moments before a person who has been outside the building enters it. There is an additional stillness. There is a tension in the listening of the woman of the house, whose hands continue their work at the spindle, but whose head has turned, very slightly, toward the door. The change is enough for us to notice. We have been in the room long enough now that the variations in its quiet are beginning to be visible to us. The latch of the door lifts. The door swings inward. A man steps in, and behind him a grey collie dog. The dog, a thin gust of cold air comes in with them and moves through the room toward the fire, where it briefly makes the smoke jump in a new direction before the air settles again and the smoke resumes its ordinary upward progress. The man is the man of the house. He has a long shirt of unbleached linen, gathered at the waist by a leather belt. He has draped over the upper part of his body, and falling below his knees, a great length of woolen plaid in the patterns of the local cloth, the same patterns we noticed on the woman of the house's smaller plaid, fastened at the shoulder with a brass pin and arranged in the careful folds that the wearing of the plaid requires. He has rough wool stockings on his legs, and shoes of untanned leather on his feet. He has a wool bonnet on his head that he removes as he steps inside and hangs on a peg beside the door. His hair, when the bonnet is off, is dark, tied back at the nape of the neck with a leather thong. The dog has gone without any direction to a particular spot near the byre end of the room, where there is a hollow worn into the rushes of the floor by the long use of dogs in this position, and has lain down in it, with his head on his paws and his eyes following the movements of the people in the room. The dog is, like the cow and the goat, part of the household. The dog has a name which the family will use when they speak to him, and which we will hear in the course of the evening when one of them happens to call him. The dog is the working dog of the man of the house, who works the flock of sheep that the household keeps on the upper part of the hill behind the settlement, and the dog will, during the daytime hours, be on the hill with him, and will, in the evening hours, lie in his hollow near the byre, and watched the family at their evening tasks. The man of the house has, on his way to the door, stopped at the threshold and stamped his feet to knock the worst of the wet earth off his shoes. He has, on entering, glanced toward the corner where we are sitting, and he has, by an inclination of his head, acknowledged our presence. He does not, on the whole, address us directly. He does not need to. The conventions of the room provide, for the situation we are now in, an arrangement of acknowledgments that does not require speech. We have been seen. We are accepted. We are part of the room for the evening. The man of the house, having performed the acknowledgment, has gone to the side of the fire opposite the woman of the house and has sat down on the long settle, with the easy weariness of a man who has been on his feet on a wet hill since before sunrise. He stretches his legs toward the fire. He rests his hands on his knees. He looks for a moment at the fire. He looks then at the woman of the house. They exchange a few words in the language of the household, which is the Gaelic that has been the language of this glen for as long as anyone can remember. The words are not many. The words are the ordinary words of a husband and wife who have been together long enough that most of what they say to each other is said without the words being needed at all. The woman of the house responds with a movement of her shoulder. The man of the house nods. He looks back at the fire. The exchange has accomplished, in the way of such exchanges, whatever it needed to accomplish. The fire continues to burn. The kettle continues to steam. The smoke continues to rise. The dog, in his hollow, has closed his eyes. The children come in not long afterwards. There are 3 of them in this household, of an age to be in the room in the evening. There is an older boy of perhaps 12, who has been on the hill with his father all day, and who has come in with him and gone, while we were not looking to a corner where he has been sitting quietly, watching everything. There is a girl of perhaps 9, who has been at the burn drawing water with her mother earlier in the afternoon, and who has been more recently at the kitchen garden behind the house, lifting the last of the autumn kale, and who comes in now with a basket of kale and sets it on the floor near the trestle where the woman of the house will, in due course, attend to it. There is a smaller boy of perhaps 5, who has been in and out of the house several times since we arrived, and who comes in now and goes directly to his mother's stool and stands beside her, watching her hands at the spinning, with the absolute concentration that children give to the sight of a parent at work. There are also, in the household, 2 younger children who at this hour are already in the box bed behind the partition, asleep on the heather under their share of the blankets. They have been put down for the night an hour ago, after their evening meal, which the woman of the house has given them earlier than the rest of the family will eat, in the way of households that have children to manage. The children in the box bed will, in the course of the evening, occasionally make sounds, the soft sounds that sleeping children make, and the woman of the house, when she hears them, will lift her head briefly and listen, and, when she has confirmed that the sounds are the sounds of sleep rather than the sounds of waking, will return to her spinning. The girl of 9, whose name the family uses with the particular affection that older daughters of this age receive, has gone to the trestle and is now setting it up for the evening meal. The trestle is brought out from where it has been leaning against the wall. The legs are unfolded. The top is set on the legs, and the piece of household furniture that during the day has been almost invisible against the wall now occupies a definite presence in the centre of the room, a few feet back from the fire. The girl, having set up the trestle, goes to the shelf and takes down the wooden bowls. There are on the shelf perhaps a dozen wooden bowls of various sizes, turned from local pine on a lathe by the man of the house's father in his younger years, and the bowls have been in the household since before the girl was born. She takes down the number of bowls that the evening's meal will require. She sets them on the trestle. She goes back to the shelf and takes down the wooden spoons. The spoons, like the bowls, are of local make, and bowls are arranged on the trestle in the familiar pattern that the family uses for its evening meals. The older boy, in his corner, is doing some task that we cannot quite see. He has, we eventually realize, a piece of wood in his hand and a knife, and he is whittling. He is making, by the look of it, the rough beginnings of a wooden peg of some kind, the sort of peg that is used to hold together the wooden parts of a household tool when iron pegs are not available or not preferred. He is concentrating. He is not speaking. He is, in his quiet way, doing his own evening work, in the way of older children of the household who have begun to take on the constant maintenance tasks of the place. The smaller boy, beside his mother, has begun to ask her something in a low voice. She is answering him in the same low voice, without taking her eyes from her work. The exchange is the ordinary exchange of a boy and his mother at the end of the day. The questions about something he has seen earlier, or something he is wondering about, or something his older brother said that he did not understand, and the mother, in the patient way of mothers of this kind, is answering him without breaking the steady rhythm of her hands at the spindle. The man of the house has, after his initial sitting down, removed his shoes. He is rubbing his feet, which have been wet all day, in front of the fire to dry them. He has a pair of dry stockings that he will, in a moment, put on. The wet stockings he is wearing, he is having pulled them off, draping over a wooden rack that stands near the fire for the purpose. The rack will hold the stockings overnight, and in the morning they will be dry, and tomorrow they will be back on his feet for the day's work on the hill. The dog has not moved. The dog is asleep. The room is now, in some sense, full. The room contains the household. The room contains us. The room is, by the standards of the buildings of the place and the period, quite ordinarily full. The room would, on an ordinary evening with no visitors, contain the same arrangement of bodies and objects and activities, with the adjustment that the bench where we are sitting would, in our absence, hold a basket of unsorted wool, or a heap of knitting in progress, or the household store of dried herbs that needed turning. The fullness of the room is, we begin to realize, part of the point. The room is the size that the room is in, part because the room is meant to hold all of these things together. The animals at the byre end, the fire in the middle, the sleeping arrangements at the back, the working area near the door. The whole arrangement is one space, with no separations beyond the partition at the back and the low screen of the byre, because the warmth of the fire has to reach all of the inhabitants, and the warmth of the fire is in a place where the winter is long and cold. The principal asset that the household has. To divide the room into separate rooms would be to divide the heat. To divide the heat would be to make some parts of the building cold. The single long room, which to a stranger from elsewhere might seem cramped and confused, is, on careful examination, an extremely sensible response to the climate of the place and the resources available for the building of houses. Everything that needs to be near the fire is near the fire. The animals at the byre end keep the worst of the wind from coming in through the door. The chest and the box bed at the back end keep the deepest part of the room shielded by their own bulk. The fire, in the middle, distributes its warmth in a circle that reaches, more or less evenly, every corner of the room. The arrangement is, in its long-evolved practical sense, very nearly ideal for what it is meant to do. It has been worked out, over centuries, by people whose lives have depended on getting the working of the room right. The smoke, of course, is the price. The smoke fills the room. The smoke is, in its long action on the lungs of the people who breathe it, gradually reducing the lifespans of all of them by some amount. But the smoke is also, in another way, what makes the room habitable. The smoke fills the spaces between the timbers of the roof, and the smoke kills the insects and parasites that would otherwise live in the timbers, and the smoke preserves the timbers themselves against rot, and the smoke darkens the underside of the thatch in a way that helps to seal it against rain. The smoke is doing several different things at once. The smoke is part of the system. The woman of the house has by now finished a particular section of her spinning. She has wound the new thread onto the spindle in the careful conical shape that her hands have learned to produce. She has set the spindle aside, propped against the leg of her stool. She has stood up. She stands for a moment beside the fire. She stretches her shoulders. She rolls her neck slightly to one side and then to the other. She has, in the course of her afternoon's work, accumulated the stiffness that the constant fine motion of spinning produces in the upper body, and the stretching is the relief that her body needs before it begins the next part of the evening's work. Cudney. She goes to the trestle. She takes the basket of kale that the girl has brought in. She takes the kale to a low wooden bench beside the fire that we have not, until now, paid attention to, and that we now see as a working surface where she does the chopping and preparing that the meals require. She has an iron knife, well used, hanging by a leather loop from a peg above the bench. She takes the knife. She begins to strip the kale leaves from their thick stalks. The leaves go into a wooden bowl. The stalks go into a smaller bowl to be given to the cow at the morning milking. The work is unhurried. The work is methodical. The work is the work that the woman of the house has done every evening of her adult life at this hour, and the motions of her hands, as she strips the leaves and separates them from the stalks, are as automatic and as efficient as the motions of her hands at the spinning. She has not, on the whole, been thinking about the kale. The kale has been processing itself by means of her hands, while her mind has been somewhere else, on the thoughts of the day, or on the plans for tomorrow, or on whatever the woman of the house, at the end of a long day, a long autumn, finds her mind moving toward when her hands are doing what her hands have always done. When the kale is stripped, she takes the bowl of leaves and goes to the kettle. She lifts the kettle off the chain by means of a leather pad in her hand, sets the kettle aside on the hearth, and looks into the water. The water is by now hot. The water has been, for the last quarter of an hour, on the edge of boiling, and the bubbles that have been rising along the inside of the kettle have begun to break the surface of the water in a steady simmer. She lowers the kale leaves into the water. She returns the kettle to the chain. She watches it for a moment. She nods slightly to herself. She returns to the trestle. She has, near the trestle, a wooden barrel that we have already noticed, that holds the household's principal supply of meal. The meal is oatmeal, ground from the oats that the household has grown on its own piece of arable ground in the lower part of the glen, and that has been ground at the watermill that serves the settlement, and that is now sitting in the barrel ready for use. She lifts the lid of the barrel. She measures with a wooden scoop several scoopfuls of meal into a large wooden bowl. She returns the lid to the barrel. She takes the bowl of meal to the bench by the fire. She takes a smaller jug from a shelf. She fills the jug from a wooden pail of water that is standing near the door, the pail having been filled from the burn earlier in the afternoon by the girl. She brings the jug back to the bench. She begins, in a steady motion, to add water to the meal a little at a time, working it with her hands as she goes, until the meal in the bowl has become a thick, wet paste that holds together in the way that the cooking requires. This is the beginning of the evening's principal dish. The dish is what the household has been eating for its evening meals at this season of the year for as long as anyone in the household can remember. The dish is what the household will eat for its evening meal on most evenings, until the spring comes and the year's work begins again. The dish is, in its essence, oatmeal cooked in water, with the kale that has just gone into the kettle, and with whatever additions the woman of the house has on a given evening. Tonight, by what we have been watching, the meal will include a piece of dried fish that she has taken down from the wall, that she is now cutting into thin strips on the bench, and that will, when the kale and the meal are ready, be added to the pot to provide the flavour and the nourishment that the dried fish provides. There will also be, when the time comes, a dish of butter to go with the meal, and a bowl of curds, and the household's evening drink, which is the milk of the cow that the girl has milked at the late afternoon's milking, and that is now standing in a wooden pail near the door, covered with a wet cloth to keep the flies away. The whole meal, in its components, is the meal of a household in this glen at this season, at this period, and the components are the components that the household produces. more or less, from its own land and its own animals and the purchases that the packmen bring through. While the meal is preparing itself in the kettle, with the woman of the house attending to it in her unhurried way, the man of the house has begun his own evening's work. He has not, as we might have expected, sat back to rest. He has instead taken from a corner near the settle a wooden contraption that we recognize after a moment as the upright loom, and he has set the loom up in front of him and begun to inspect it. The loom is the household's loom, used for the weaving of belts and garters and the narrow lengths of cloth that the more elaborate weaving on the larger loom does not produce. The larger loom of the household is in a separate outbuilding attached to the side of the house, and it is used by the woman of the house and her older daughter for the principal cloth-making of the year. The loom is used by the man of the house in the evenings for the smaller pieces. He has on the loom, set up from a previous evening's work, a partly woven length of patterned cloth in the dark blues and greens of the household's plaid. He is working out a particular detail of the pattern, which is a geometric figure that recurs, in regular intervals, along the length of the cloth. He has the finished part of the pattern behind the heddles, where it has been wound on as the work progressed. He has the unfinished part in front of him, where his fingers will, in a moment, begin to add the next sequence of threads. He has a wooden shuttle in his hand, with the weft thread wound around it. He has a wooden tablet in his other hand, used for the manipulation of the threads in the pattern. He begins, after a moment of inspection, to weave. The motions of the weaving are, like woman of the house's spinning, automatic. He throws the shuttle. He beats the thread down into the cloth with a wooden beater. He moves the heddles. He throws the shuttle back. He beats again. He turns the tablet. The pattern in the cloth advances by the width of perhaps 1/16 of an inch. He repeats the motions. The pattern advances again. The work is slow. The work is patient. The work is the evening's work that, accumulated over many evenings, will eventually produce a finished length of cloth that the household needs. He does not look at his hands. He looks, mostly, at the fire. He is, like the woman of the house, working by feel and by long habit. He could do this work, if he had to, in the dark. He has in the past, on evenings when the fire has burned down further than tonight, and the light in the room has been very dim, done exactly that, with no significant loss of accuracy. The patterns of the local cloth are patterns that the hands of the people who weave them know without the eyes having to be involved. The hands have learned them. The hands continue to do them. The eyes are free to do other things. The eyes in the evenings watch the fire. The wind outside has dropped slightly. The note in the chimney corners has fallen back to the soft hum that we noticed when we first came in. The irregular gusts have ceased. The air against the walls of the house is moving steadily again rather than in fits and starts. The fire has settled. The peats that were placed earlier are now well into their burning, with a deep red glow at their hearts and a light coating of grey ash beginning to form on their tops. The kettle, with the kale in it, and now the strips of dried fish that the woman of the house has added, is simmering gently. The smell of the cooking, which is just beginning to add itself to the smell of the peat smoke, is a clean smell of cooked greens and salted fish and oatmeal, and the smell, faint at first, is gradually filling the room. Then the girl has finished setting the trestle and has gone to sit on a low stool near the bench her mother is working at. She is watching her mother. She is, by the look of her face, ready to help if she is asked, and, if she is not asked, content to sit and watch. The girl will, in the years to come, be the woman of a house of her own. The woman she will be will have learned the work of the woman of a house by sitting, on evenings like this one, and watching her own mother do it. The watching is not, in any explicit sense, the teaching. The watching is, however, where the teaching happens, and the girl, although she does not know this yet, is in the middle of the long apprenticeship that her childhood is, by the customs of the place supposed to be. The smaller boy has, at some point that we did not observe, fallen asleep against his mother's hip. She has, while continuing the preparation of the meal with her left hand, draped a corner of her plaid over him with her right. He is breathing slowly, with his mouth slightly open, in the way of children who are very tired and who have given themselves over to the sleep that the warmth of the fire and the long day's running have brought down on them. The older boy is still whittling. The peg in his hand has begun to take a definite shape. He is not, we now see, going to finish it tonight. He is, instead, doing the rough preliminary cutting that will, on some other evening, be followed by the finer shaping. He has the unhurried air of a person who knows that the work he is doing has no deadline beyond the deadline of his own willingness to do it, and that the work, like all the other wooden objects he has whittled in the corner over the years, will be finished when it is finished. The dog is still asleep. The kettle is simmering. The fire is burning. The smoke is rising. The wind is moving softly against the walls. The light in the room is the dim red light of the fire, which has now reached its evening steady level and which will hold at this level, with variations, for the next several hours. We are still on the bench. The plaid behind our back is still warm. The wood under us is still solid. The room in its unhurried way has continued to assemble itself around us, and we are, as we have been since we came in, simply present. The household has accepted us. The fire is the fire. We are in the room while it all takes place. The kettle has been simmering for some time. The kale in it has softened, and the dried fish has given up its salt and its flavour to the broth, and the meal, which the woman of the house has been adding gradually over the last quarter of an hour by spoonfuls of the wet paste from her wooden bowl, has thickened the whole into the consistency that the household considers correct. She has been stirring it with a long wooden spoon in patient circles around the inside of the kettle, lifting the spoon occasionally to test the thickness of the porridge that the dish has now become, and lowering it again to continue the stirring. The dish, when she finally judges it ready, is a thick, savoury porridge of oatmeal and kale and flecks of dried fish, with a pale brown colour from the dissolved fish and the long cooking, and with a smell that in the close air of the room has now become the dominant smell, displacing for a time even the steady undersmell of the peat smoke. The smell is nourishing rather than fragrant. The smell is the smell of food that is meant to keep working people through a long winter, rather than the smell of food that is meant to be admired. The household, which has been smelling this smell on most of its evenings since the autumn began, smells it now with the particular attention of people whose stomachs are empty and who have been on their feet since dawn. The woman of the house lifts the kettle off the chain by means of the leather pad in her hand and sets it on the hearthstone beside the fire, where it can begin to cool slightly while she ladles. She takes a wooden ladle from where it has been hanging on a peg on the wall behind her. She picks up the first of the wooden bowls from the trestle. She fills the bowl from the kettle with 3 or 4 ladles of the porridge. She sets the bowl on the trestle. She picks up the next bowl. She fills it. She sets it on the trestle. She continues, in the patient, methodical way of all her movements, until each member of the household, and ourselves as the visitors, has a filled bowl waiting at a place at the table. The man of the house has, while she has been ladling, set aside his loom and stood up and gone to a corner of the room where there is a wooden cupboard fixed to the wall. He has opened the cupboard. He has taken out an earthenware crock with a wooden lid which holds the household's butter, churned from the cream of the cow's milk over the past few days. He has brought the crock to the trestle. He has, with a wooden spreader from the same cupboard, taken a piece of butter from the crock and placed it on the surface of each filled bowl, where the butter will, in the heat of the porridge, melt slowly into a golden pool that the eater will, in due course, work into the porridge with the spoon as the eating proceeds. The girl has gone to the door. She has lifted the wet cloth off the wooden pail of milk, She has carried the pail to the trestle. She has poured from the pail into a stack of horn-drinking cups that her mother has set out, the milk that will be the household's evening drink. The horn cups are translucent in the firelight. The milk in them is the colour of thick cream. The cups are placed beside each bowl on the trestle, 1 cup for each eater. The smaller boy has been woken gently by his mother. He is now sitting upright on the floor near the trestle, rubbing his eyes with the back of his hand with the dazed expression of a child who has been pulled out of a very deep sleep and who has not yet quite reassembled his sense of where he is. He is ushered to a place at the trestle. The older boy and the older girl take their places without being told. The man and woman of the house take theirs. We are gestured with an inclination of the head from the woman to a place between the older boy and the older girl, and we sit down on the low wooden stool that has been set out for us. There is a moment, before the eating begins, of a silence. The silence is not a moment of grace in the strict religious sense, although there is the inclination of all the heads at the trestle that has, in its own way, the quality of a quiet acknowledgement. The household has its own ways of marking the start of a meal, ways that come from the deep customs of the place rather than from any explicit statement. The man of the house after a moment lifts his spoon. The others lift theirs. The eating begins. The eating is unhurried. The eating, like everything else in this room, takes the time it takes. The porridge is hot. It must be eaten in careful spoonfuls, blown on first to cool, taken into the mouth a little at a time, chewed thoroughly because the kale gives the porridge a fibrous quality that requires chewing, swallowed when the chewing is done. The intervals between spoonfuls allow for the drinking of the milk between them, and the milk, cool and rich, balances the heat of the porridge, and the alternation of the two builds a kind of rhythm to the meal. The conversation at the trestle, while the eating is going on, is not extensive. The household, by long habit, does not talk a great deal during meals. The eating is the work. The talk, when it comes in short exchanges between particular pairs of people, the man of the house and the older boy about something they have seen on the hill that day, the woman of the house and the older girl about a matter of the kale they had been working with earlier, the smaller boy with his mother about whatever thing the smaller boy is wondering about now that he is woken from his nap. The exchanges are in the Gaelic that is the household's language, and we who do not speak it follow the rhythms of the conversation rather than its content. The rhythms are the rhythms of an unhurried family meal in an unhurried evening, and the rhythms are intelligible to us in their general shape even when the words that produce them are not. The food is good. The food is more than enough for what the household needs. The bowls, by the time they are emptied, have been thoroughly scraped with the spoons, in the careful manner of people who do not waste food. The horn cups have been emptied. The girl, when the others are done, takes the empty bowls and the empty cups to a wooden basin near the door, where she will, in due course, wash them with a ration of warm water from the kettle and set them back on the shelf. She does not at the moment do this. She comes back to the trestle and sits down again. The household will, in its own time, get up from the meal, but it is not yet ready to. This is one of the features of the room and the period that we begin, only now, to fully appreciate. There is, in the rhythms of this household, no particular rush from one activity to the next. The meal is finished. The next task, whatever it is waiting. The interval between the two does not need to be hurried across. The interval is its own thing. The household sits for a little while at the empty trestle, with the remaining warmth of the eaten food in their bodies and the comfortable feeling of having eaten well, and the conversation, which had been minimal during the eating itself, picks up slightly now, in the pauses between bowls and cups and the clearing of throats and the adjusting of plates. The man of the house begins, in the way of a man who has been working on a thought all afternoon and is only now ready to share it, to talk about something he has noticed on the upper part of the hill that day. The thing is small. The thing is a particular sheep that has, in his observation, been favouring one of its hind legs. and that he is, in his mind, considering whether the leg is something that will heal of itself with rest, or whether it is something that will require his more direct attention in the morning. He tells the woman of the house. She listens. She offers in her own quiet way a thought about a previous sheep that had a similar lameness in a previous year and that healed of itself within a week. The man of the house considers her thought. He nods slightly. He says he will leave the sheep on the hill tomorrow and look at it again in the evening. The conversation, having reached its natural conclusion, drops away. The older boy mentions, then, a hawk that he saw twice in the course of the day on a particular ridge above the upper grazing. He saw the hawk first in the morning and again in the afternoon, and the hawk both times was hovering over the same spot, which suggests that the hawk had something fixed in its sights in the heather below. The older boy speculates in the way of a boy who has begun to acquire the practical observation of a working man about what the hawk might have seen. A hare, perhaps, a young grouse. The conversation about the hawk takes only a moment, but it is a real conversation, with the older boy and the man of the house discussing the details of the matter and arriving at no firm conclusion, but at the mutual satisfaction that the matter has been considered. The smaller boy, who has been listening to all of this with the particular intentness of a child who is too young to contribute, but who wants to be present at the conversation, makes a comment about the hawk in the form of a single word that we, even in our limited grasp of the language, can recognize as an approximation of the Gaelic word for hawk itself. The man of the house, recognizing the effort, smiles at the smaller boy. The exchange is the private exchange of a father and his son at the end of a day, and the exchange has its own tenderness that the older children at the trestle, who have seen many such exchanges over the years, accept without remark. The household, in due course, gets up from the trestle. The girl takes the bowls and the cups to the basin. She begins, in her unhurried way, the washing. The man of the house returns to the settle, where he sits down again, and where he begins, after a moment, to refill a short clay pipe from a leather pouch of tobacco that he keeps in an inner pocket of his coat. The tobacco is one of the household's luxuries. The tobacco has come by way of the packmen from somewhere very far away, brought up the western coast on the Hebridean trade routes, and the tobacco is one of the few things in the household that has travelled before reaching it, a longer distance than any of the people in the household have ever travelled in their own lives. The man of the house lights his pipe with a piece of peat that he takes from the edge of the fire. He draws on the pipe. The smoke of the tobacco is sharper than peat, and it rises in a distinct plume that briefly contributes a different note to the air of the room. He sits with the pipe in his hand and watches the fire. The pipe is for him the evening's pleasure. He smokes it slowly, with long pauses between draws, and he will, by his usual habit, finish the pipe over the next half hour or so, with the smoking interleaved with the conversations and the returns to his weaving and the attendances to whatever else the evening calls for. The woman of the house has returned to her stool beside the fire. She has taken up the spindle again. The wool that she has not yet finished spinning is still on the distaff at her belt. She has, while she was preparing the meal, wound the length of thread she had spun earlier onto the spindle, and the spindle is now ready to receive more. She has begun with the same automatic motion as before, the constant twirling of the spindle that the spinning requires. The older boy has gone back to his corner. He has taken up his whittling again, although the light in the corner is now too dim for the finer work he had been doing earlier, and he is, instead, simply turning the wooden peg in his fingers, examining it, considering its shape. He will, in due course, return to the more active work, either in the better light of the morning or of a later position closer to the fire. For the moment he is content to sit and consider and wait. The girl, having finished the washing, has come back into the main part of the room and has sat down on a low stool beside her mother. She has taken from a basket beside her mother's stool a piece of knitting in progress. The knitting is the early section of a pair of woolen stockings in the natural grey of undyed sheep's wool, with the heel turning that the stocking will eventually have already prepared in the careful counted stitches that the work requires. She begins with her own pair of wooden needles to add to the stocking. The girl has been knitting since she was 6. The girl, by the standards of the place, is now becoming proficient. The stocking that is at the moment in her hands is a stocking that when finished will be wearable by an adult. And the girl, knowing this, is concentrating on her work with the pride that a young person feels when their work is, for the first time, of the standard that the adult work of the household requires. The smaller boy has by now gone to his mother and crawled into her lap. She is with one hand continuing her spinning and with the other arm holding him against her side. He has his head on her shoulder. His eyes are closing again. He will in another few minutes be asleep again. This time, by the look of it, for the rest of the night, and the woman of the house will, when he is fully asleep, get up and carry him to the box bed and lay him beside the children who are already asleep there, and will return to her stool and resume her work. The dog is still in his hollow. The dog has not moved for some time. The dog is asleep. The dog has lived in this house for 9 years. The dog was, when he came, a puppy of about 3 months, given to the man of the house by an uncle in the same glen who had bred a litter of working collies from his own dogs. The dog has been since his earliest days a working dog. The dog has been trained over the years by the man of the house in the work of moving the household's flock of sheep across the upper hill, and the dog, by this point in his career, knows the work as well as the man knows it, and the two together, the man and the dog, have been working the same flock on the same hill for so long that the work between them runs almost without instruction. The dog's mother lived for 15 years. The dog's grandfather, who is in the man of the house's memory, lived for 16. The dog, by these family precedents, has perhaps another 6 or 7 years of working life ahead of him, and the man of the house, who has been thinking in the last year about the eventual replacement of the dog, has been considering, in his own quiet way, which of the dog's eventual offspring will most likely be the next dog in this hollow. There has been, so far, no resolution to this consideration. The dog in the meantime lies in his hollow and breathes the deep breaths of a dog at the deepest middle of his evening's rest, and the man of the house occasionally glances at him in the quiet way that men of houses glance at the dogs of their long association, and the glances are, in their own way, part of the daily texture of the affection that holds them. The animals in the byre, at the other end of the room, have been making throughout this period the low sounds that animals at rest make. The cow has shifted her weight, occasionally, from one set of legs to the other. The cow has chewed her cud, in the steady jaw motion of a cow that has eaten well during the day and is now in the long evening's rumination. The goat has twice made a soft bleating sound that has not been answered by the kid, who is asleep against her side. The animals are part of the room. The animals contribute by their sounds and their presences to the texture of the room, and the room would be, in their absence, a different and a less complete place. The smell of the animals, which we noted when we first came in, has, by this stage of the evening, become, like the smell of the peat smoke, something that the nose has stopped registering. The nose, after a certain interval of exposure to a constant smell, simply stops sending the smell to the conscious attention. The smell is still there, but the brain, with the efficiency of brains in general, has decided that the smell is not new information and has stopped reporting it. We are now in the same state, with respect to the smell of the animals and peat smoke and all the other smells of the room, as the household itself is. We have become, in our nose, a member of the household for the evening. Smell of the goat, the slightly sweetish smell of the cow's milk on her flanks where the girl's hands brushed against her at the milking, the sharper smell of the goat's bedding straw, which has not been changed for 2 days, the leathery smell of the dog's hollow, the smaller, dustier smell of the bracken in the children's bed behind the partition, the clean smell of the rushes on the floor that were brought in fresh a few days ago, the acid smell of the unbleached linen of the household's working clothes hanging on their pegs, the woolen smell of the various plaids and blankets, the grain smell of the meal in the barrel near the trestle, the dried smell of the herbs hanging from the rafters. All of these smaller smells are present in the air of the room, and all of them by now are below the threshold of our conscious noticing. We are in our nose fully in the room. We are in our nose no longer a visitor. The room has accepted us in this way, as it has accepted us in the other ways through the course of the evening. The man of the house, finishing his pipe, gets up from the settle and goes to the byre. He stands at the low wooden screen. He looks at the cow. He says in a low voice a few words to her, in the way of a man who has been speaking to this cow and to the cow's mother's mother for the whole of his adult life, and who knows that the speaking is not, in the strict sense, useful, but who continues to speak because the speaking is part of the relationship. The cow does not respond. The cow continues to chew her cud. The man of the house, having said what he wanted to say, comes back to the settle. He has, in the course of the visit to the byre, also checked the wooden bar across the inside of the door. The bar is, for the night, going to be set in place across the door, and the bar will hold the door against the wind. The man of the house has not yet put the bar in place. He will do that later, when the household is ready to retire. For the moment, the bar is leaning against the wall beside the door, and the man of the house has glanced at it in the routine way of a man who is mentally noting that the task of barring the door is, when the time comes, going to be the next task. He sits down on the settle again. He has, while he was up, taken from a corner near the cupboard a wooden box that we have not, until now, noticed. The box contains, when he opens it, an assortment of leather-working tools and a piece of leather that he is in the process of cutting into the shape of a strap for some purpose connected with the harness of the Highland pony that the household keeps for the carrying of peats from the upper bog to the door. He takes out the leather. He takes out an awl and a leather-cutting knife. He sets the box on the settle beside him. He begins, in the same unhurried way as everything else in the room, to work on the strap. It's sacred. The room now has settled into the quietest period of the evening. The noises that the room contains are the noises of handwork, the click of the woman of the house's spindle as it strikes the floor and is picked up again, the whisper of her hands as they twirl the spindle, the soft clicks of the girl's knitting needles as they pass each stitch from one needle to the other, the scrape of the man of the house's leather knife as it cuts along the line he has marked on the strap, the exhalations of the various sleeping bodies in the room, the smaller boy in his mother's lap, and the children behind the partition, and the dog in his hollow, the sounds of the animals at the byre end, the popping of the peats on the fire as pockets of moisture in them release their steam, the steady simmer of the water that remains in the kettle, which has been set on the chain again with fresh water in it for the household's washing later in the evening, the soft hum of the wind against the outside of the walls. These sounds are all there is in the room for some time. The conversation, which had picked up slightly at the end of the meal, has dropped away again. The household is now, in its own way, in the part of the evening that does not require speech. The work is happening. The work does not require comment. The presence of the household members in the room, doing their separate evening tasks, is its own communication, and the household, which has been doing this on evenings of this kind for many years, knows the rhythms well enough that no one needs to direct them or comment on them. Husbüder. We, on the bench, are watching the fire. The fire, in the time since we have come in, has gone through several phases of its own. It was high when we arrived, with the peats freshly laid on it for the boiling of the kettle. It settled during the cooking of the meal into a steady low burning. It has been, in the period since the meal, slowly building back up as the cooking heat is no longer needed, and the heating heat is what is wanted. The man of the house, before sitting down with his strap, has placed a fresh peat on the fire, and the fresh peat is, at this moment, just beginning to catch, with a line of red along one edge of it. The line of red will, over the next half hour, spread across the surface of the peat, and the peat will, in due course, settle into the same steady red glow that the older peats beneath it have already reached. We watch the spreading of the red line. There is, in the watching, a particular quiet attention that the work of watching a peat fire develop inevitably produces. The eye follows the advance of the colour. The eye, in the course of this watching, finds itself going deeper into the details. The fibres of the long-dead vegetation that pressed and pressed over centuries to form it, the ash that is beginning to whiten the upper edge, the thin column of pale smoke that is rising from the new peat, distinct from the deeper smoke of the older peats beneath. The watching is the kind of activity that, after a few minutes, produces in the watcher a settling of the attention into the very small. The mind, which has been tracking the larger features of the room, begins to release them. The room, the household, the tasks of the various people in it, all of these recede into a kind of background, and what is left in the front of the mind is the advance of the red line on the surface of the peat. The whole evening, from a certain point of view, narrows itself down to this: the fire is the centre. We have been working our way toward the fire, in the unhurried way of the room itself since we came in, and we are now, at this hour, and in this place, simply with the fire. The fire is doing what the fire does. We are watching it. The fire, considered carefully, is not, in any strict sense, one thing. The fire is a population of burning peats, each one with its own life cycle, each one in its own phase of the burning, and the appearance of the fire at any given moment is the composite of the appearances of all the peats together. The peat at the bottom of the heap, which was placed first when the fire was built up earlier in the evening, is now in its late phase, with most of its substance already converted to ash and only a dense red core remaining. The peats above it, which were placed later, are at various intermediate phases, with their cores red and their surfaces variously ashed. The newest peat, placed by the man of the house some little while ago, is in its early phase, with its surface only partly caught, and a thin column of pale smoke still rising from the unburnt portion. The fire, taken altogether, is therefore a kind of procession, with each peat moving through its own life cycle at its own rate, and the whole fire being constantly renewed by the placement of new peats at the top, while the older peats below complete their burning and gradually become the accumulating bed of grey ash that will, in the morning, be raked out and added to the household's ash store. The fire is in this respect like a long river, with new water always coming in at one end and old water always passing out at the other, and the river, in spite of the constant change, presenting a generally constant appearance from one moment to the next. The fire is in another respect like the household itself, with each generation moving through its own life cycle at its own rate, and the household, in spite of the constant succession of births and deaths and marriages and removals, presenting a generally constant character from one decade to the next. The fire is a community of burning peats. The household is a community of breathing people. The room is a community of both, and the room, in its long life, has held the turnings of both communities through the long succession of the evenings of its existence. The wind outside has come up again slightly. We hear it in the corners of the room and in the adjustments that the smoke at the top of the room makes as the variations of the air move it. The wind is not, by the standards of a Highland evening at this season, a strong wind. The wind is the wind of an ordinary autumn night, with no rain in it at the moment, although there is the slight quality in the air that suggests that rain may come later. The wind is doing what the wind has been doing all evening, with variations of strength and direction, and the household, which has registered the wind's changes without comment, will continue to register them in the same way for the rest of the evening. The fire is the centre, The handwork of the people in the room is the texture between them. The smaller boy has at last slipped fully into sleep on his mother's lap. She has, in the last few minutes, completed the section of spinning she was working on. She lays the spindle aside. She gathers the smaller boy more securely into her arms. She stands up, with the easy, practiced motion of a woman who has carried sleeping children many times. She carries him slowly across the room to the partition at the back. She passes through the opening in the partition. She lays him with the same easy, practiced motion on the heather of the children's bed, beside the children who are already asleep there. She arranges the blanket over him. She stands for a moment looking at the still shape of him. She returns to the main part of the room. She does not, when she comes back to the fire, immediately resume her work. She stands for a moment at the hearth. She looks at the fire. She reaches up and touches her hair briefly, with the slightly absent motion of a person who is between one task and the next, and is for that moment simply in the room. She lowers her hand. She sits down on her stool. She picks up the spindle. She resumes the spinning. The pause has lasted perhaps half a minute. The pause has accomplished in its own way whatever it was that the pause needed to accomplish, and the next stage of the evening has now begun. The fire is the center. The wind is the surround. The work of the household is the texture between them. The evening, in its unhurried way, continues. We are still on the bench. We are still watching. We still have nowhere else to be. There is, in many Highland houses at this hour of the evening, a particular kind of quiet talk that begins to develop after the principal work of the evening has settled into its rhythm. The talk is not, on the whole, conversation in the modern sense. The talk is more like the deliberate offering of stories and observations and remembered things, set down by one person in the room and picked up, after a pause, by another. The stories are not the stories of large events. Stories are the stories of remembered details, the kind of details that the household has been remembering and re-remembering on evenings of this kind for as long as the household has existed. The man of the house, after working on his strap for some time in silence, sets the strap down on his knee and looks at the fire and says, in his careful way, that he has been thinking, in the course of the day, about an old man who used to live in this glen when the man of the house was himself a boy. The old man is long dead. The old man, by the man of the house's calculation, has been dead for nearly 30 years. But the old man, when he was alive, had a particular habit of singing, in a low voice, a particular song, while he was walking down to the burn for water in the early morning. The man of the house, who has not thought about this old man for some years, has been thinking about him today, because the boy of 12, who has the early morning task of bringing water from the burn, has been, in recent weeks, singing, in a low voice, a similar song of his own composition on the same walk. The two songs are not the same song. The two singers are not the same singer. But the resemblance in the man of the house's mind has been working all day, and he wants, now, in the quiet of the evening, to mention it. The woman of the house, who has been listening with the attention that she gives to her husband's remembered stories, considers what he has said. She says after a moment that she also in her own time knew the old man. She says that she remembers him as a tall, thin figure with a long white beard and a way of stopping in the middle of a path to look at things in the heather, the kinds of things that other people walked past without seeing. She says that the old man, she believes, was the great-uncle of a particular woman who is now living in a neighbouring glen, and who is, she has heard, not in the best of health this autumn. She says that someone from the household will need to walk over to the neighbouring glen, when the weather permits, to see how the woman is doing. The man of the house nods. He does not immediately reply. The boy of 12, who has been listening from his corner, says nothing, because the private fact of his own singing on the walk to the burn has just been mentioned in his hearing by his father, and he is not sure, at this moment, whether to be embarrassed or pleased that the singing has been noticed. The girl, who has not been singing on her own walks to the burn, looks at the boy with the interest of a sister who has just learned a new thing about her brother. The smaller boy, who is asleep behind the partition, hears nothing. The conversation, having opened up the remembered figure of the old man, allows the room to settle briefly into a kind of remembering. The man of the house remembers, after a further pause, that the old man had a dog that always went with him on his walks, and that the dog was, by the man of the house's recollection, a particular shade of red that was unusual in the dogs of the place. The woman of the house remembers in turn that the old man's wife was a famous baker of the flat oatcakes that the household still makes, and that the wife had a particular method of pressing the oatcakes onto the baking stone that produced a slightly thinner and crisper oatcake than other women in the glen produced. She says that her own mother, who learned the baking from the old man's wife in her own youth, taught her, the woman of the house, the method, and that the oatcakes she herself bakes are, in their basic technique, the oatcakes of the old man's wife 2 generations back. These things accumulate in the room without making a story in any directed sense. The things are remembered. The things are spoken of. The things sit in the air for a moment, between the speaking of them and the next remembering, and then the conversation moves to the next remembered thing. The pace of the talk is rest of the evening. The girl, after some time, begins to hum. She hums very quietly, without breaking the rhythm of her knitting, a tune that the household recognizes. The tune is one of the Gaelic airs that the children of the glen learn from their mothers and grandmothers, and that the women of the glen sing at various moments of the day's work, in the way that women have been singing such airs in such places for as long as the airs have existed. The tune the girl is humming is one of the slower and more melancholy of these airs, the kind of air that has, in its repeated phrases, the quality of something that has been worn smooth by the long hands of time. The woman of the house, hearing the girl's humming, joins it after a moment, very softly, with her own voice. She does not stop her spinning. She does not look at the girl. She simply adds her voice to the girl's in the easy, unself-conscious way of a woman who has been singing with her daughters since the daughters were small, and the 2 voices, the girl's higher and the woman's lower, take up the air together and follow it through one of its repeated cycles. The man of the house, who is not himself a singer, listens. He continues to work on his strap. The strap is, by this point, mostly cut, and he is now working on the holes that will need to be punched at one end for the buckle. He works on the holes with his awl, with the punching and the scraping that the work requires, producing a faint accompaniment in the room to the singing of the woman and the girl. The older boy, whose own habit of singing on the walk to the burn has just been mentioned in the conversation, listens to his mother and sister. He does not, on the whole, sing in the household, although he has been heard, on his solitary walks to the burn, to sing in the private way that has been mentioned. The singing in the room is the singing of the women. He listens. He does not, by his expression, give any sign of having any reaction to it. He may, in his private mind, be thinking about it. The mind of an older boy in this household, like the minds of older boys in any household, is its own enclosed thing. The dog, in his hollow, has lifted his head briefly during the singing. The dog has for a moment listened to the singing with the slightly attentive ear position of a dog that is registering an unfamiliar sound. The dog has, after a moment, recognized that the sound is the sound of the woman of the house and the girl singing, which is a sound the dog has heard many times, and the dog has lowered his head onto his paws again and resumed his sleep. Paspertons. The cow, in the byre, has not reacted to the singing. The cow has heard so much singing in the course of her life in this byre that she no longer registers it. The goat, similarly, has not reacted. The kid is asleep. The singing goes on for a few minutes. The air is, in its full form, a long and complex piece with several verses and a slow circular structure, and the woman and the girl between them take it through one full cycle and then through most of a second before the woman of the house, who has reached a particular point in her spinning that requires both her hands and a moment of concentration, lets her voice trail off, and the girl, with the particular sense of the girl who knows when her mother is leaving the singing, allows her own voice to trail off shortly afterwards, and the singing comes to its end. The room is, after the singing, slightly different. The air of the room has been moved, not by any physical movement, but by the introduction and the departure of the music, and the silence that follows the music has a slightly different quality than the silence that preceded it. The silence is, for a moment, fuller. The silence holds, for a short while, the memory of the air that was just sung, and the listeners in the room, including ourselves, are still hearing in some part of the inner ear the repeated phrases of the tune. The fire during the singing has continued to burn. The new peat that the man of the house had placed on the fire some time ago has by now fully caught and is now in the steady red phase of its burning. The older peats below it have by now begun to form the low mounds of grey ash that mark their late stage. The fire, taken all together, is now in the deepest middle of its evening's life, with several hours of burning still ahead of it before the banking will need to begin. The wind, in the moment after the singing has ended, is briefly more audible than it has been for some time, partly because the singing was, by its presence, masking the wind, and partly because the wind has, during the singing, picked up slightly. The wind is now blowing with a slightly stronger note in the chimney corners, and the irregular gusts have returned, breaking the steady note into the alternation of softer and louder hums that we noticed earlier in the evening. Man of the house, registering the wind, looks briefly at the door. The door, with its leather hinges and its wooden latch, is firm against the wind at the present level. The man of the house, having confirmed this, returns to his work. The girl, who has been knitting through all of this, has reached a particular point in her stocking that requires her to count the stitches. She holds the work close to the firelight, with the concentration of a young person whose eyes are still good, but whose work is detailed and whose count must be exact. She moves her lips as she counts. She nods when she has finished the counting. She makes the adjustment, by means of a movement of her needle, that she had been planning to make if the count came out as she expected, and she resumes the knitting. The woman of the house, who has been watching the girl from the corner of her eye, smiles slightly. The girl has counted correctly. The girl has resumed the knitting in the proper way. The private satisfaction of the woman of the house, watching her daughter perform, in the routine of the household, a task that the girl is just now becoming proficient at, is one of the pleasures of the evening, and the woman of the house, like thee, is in the comfortable habit of taking these pleasures as they come. There is, after some time, a slight rearrangement in the room. The boy of 12, who has been in his corner all evening, gets up and stretches and comes over to the fire. He sits down on the floor, near the settle, in the space between the settle and the hearth, with his back against the wooden support of the settle, and his face toward the fire. He is, by his posture, settling in for the deeper evening's listening. He has, by his manner, indicated that he is now ready for whatever stories the evening is going to produce. The man of the house, recognizing the movement of his elder son into the listening position, sets aside his leather work. He gets up briefly to add another peat to the fire. He sits down again. He lights, from another coal, the second filling of his pipe, which he has been holding ready in his lap for some time. He draws on the pipe. He looks at the fire. The man of the house, after a long quiet pause, begins to tell, in his slow, careful way, a story he has not told for some time. The story is not a large story. The story does not involve, as the briefing has reminded us, any battle or any politics or any large historical event. The story is the story of a winter many years ago in this same house, when the snow on the hill came down lower than the snow had ever come down in the man of the house's memory, and the household, which had been planning to drive the cattle to a particular grazing on the lower slopes that was usually free of snow even in the worst weather, had to keep the cattle in the byre for an additional fortnight, and the household, in those 2 extra weeks, had run very short on the hay that had been laid in for the winter, and the man of the house's father, who was then house, had walked at the end of the 2nd week to a neighbouring glen in the deep snow with a request to borrow hay from a relative there. The relative, who is called by the man of the house by a particular Gaelic name that we do not catch, had agreed to lend the hay, and the man of the house's father had spent the better part of 2 days carrying bundles of borrowed hay back through the snow on his own back, because the pony of the household was in too thin a condition to be sent. The hay that he carried was enough, with the existing stores, to keep the cattle through the additional time before the snow finally lifted. The cattle survived the winter. The man of the house's father, however, took a deep cold from the journeys in the snow, and was for several weeks afterward in his bed, and the man of the house, who was then a boy of about the same age as the boy of 12 who is now listening, had to take on the work of the household during his father's recovery, with the help of his mother and his older sister. This is the story. The story is slow. The story has, in the telling, no particular point beyond the simple recollection of the events, with the details that the man of the house remembers and that he wants to tell because the details are what the story is. The man of the house tells in the course of the story that the snow on the 2nd day of his father's journeys had come up over the tops of his father's leather shoes and into the wool of his father's stockings, and that the wet stockings had been, in the man of the house's memory, the principal subject of his mother's daily complaint over the following 2 weeks, because the stockings had been a particular pair that the woman of the house had spent a long time knitting, and that she had not wanted to see ruined in the way that they had been. He tells in the course of the story that the relative in the neighbouring glen had given his father, along with the hay, a piece of dried mutton that the relative had been saving for his own household spring meals, and that the dried mutton, when it came back to this house, had been the feast of the boy of 12, who is the present man of the house, who had not had a piece of dried mutton in his mouth since the previous autumn. He tells in the course of the story that the snow had finally lifted on the morning of a particular day in late February, with a slow, steady, warm rain that had melted the snow off the lower hills in the space of 3 days, and that the cattle, when they were finally driven out of the byre into the warm, wet weather, had been, in their joy, almost difficult to manage. The story takes, in the telling, perhaps a quarter of an hour. The boy of 12, who has heard parts of this story before, but who has not heard the whole of it for some time, listens with the slightly different attention of an older boy who is now old enough to register the practical details of the story rather than just the dramatic outline. The girl, who has not heard the story in its full form before, listens with the wide attention of a younger child. The woman of the house, who has heard the story many times, listens with the easy, familiar pleasure of a wife who is hearing her husband tell, again, a story he tells well. The man of the house himself, telling the story, is not, on the whole, performing. He is instead simply remembering, out loud, in the room, in the deepest middle of an evening that is now a very long way from the ordinary working hours of the day. When the story is finished, there is a silence. The man of the house draws on his pipe. He looks at the fire. He sets the pipe down on a wooden tray on the settle beside him. He picks up his leather work again. The story is over. The evening has, in the telling of the story, advanced by a quarter of an hour, and the room has settled, after the story, into a slightly quieter quiet than the quiet that came before it. The story has had on the room the particular effect that good stories slowly told have on the rooms they are told in. The room is now, having heard the story, slightly different. The night, outside, has by now fully arrived. The dim square of grey light at the high window has gone dark. The doorway, which had been letting in an amount of late afternoon light when we came in, is now closed and bolted, and even when it was last opened, an hour or more ago, The light outside it was no different from the light inside the room. The world outside has become, in this period, the world that the wind brings into the room, the world of the steady note of the wind in the corners and the irregular gusts that move against the walls. The world outside, beyond the wind, is the dark hill above the settlement, the dark glen with the burn running through it, the dark sky above the glen with whatever stars can be seen through the cloud, the dark houses of the other inhabitants of the settlement, each with its own fire and its own household, working its way through the same slow evening that this household is working through. The fire in the centre of the room is now the brightest thing for some considerable distance. The fire is the only light in the immediate neighbourhood. The fire has been the only light for some time. The fire, taken with the other fires of the other houses of the settlement, makes up the constellation of human warmth that the glen, on a night of this kind, contains. From the upper hill, if any traveller were standing there at this hour, the red points of light from the smoke holes of the houses would be visible across the dark valley, and the red points would be the only visible signs that there were any people in the glen at all. The hill, at this hour, is empty of people. The glen, at this hour, contains only the fires. The boy of 12, after the story and the silence that followed it, has begun, in his low voice, to ask his father a question about something the father said. The father, having been asked, considers his answer for a moment and then begins to give it, in the same slow, careful way that he tells his stories. The answer is not a story in itself. The answer is an explanation of a detail, the kind of detail that the boy of 12 is now, at his age, beginning to want to understand more fully. The conversation between the father and the son moves, in the slow way of these conversations, through several related topics, with the father offering a piece of his accumulated knowledge of the practical details of the place, and the son listening and, occasionally, asking the next question that the previous answer has produced. This is, in many Highland households of this period, the ordinary educational practice of the long winter evenings. The boys of 12 are, by their age, ready to begin acquiring the more detailed knowledge of the household's working life, and the long evenings beside the fire, with the father at his evening tasks and the son nearby, are the time during which a great deal of this knowledge is slowly and informally transmitted. The knowledge is not transmitted in any formal way. The knowledge is, instead, transmitted in the answers to the questions that the son, in his own time, asks. The answers, accumulated over years, become the body of practical knowledge that the son will, in his own adult life, possess. The boy of 12 is now in the middle of this long process. The boy will, in another 5 or 6 years, have learned by the same slow process most of what he will need to know to be a man of a household in this place. The girl, in her own way, is learning the same kind of thing from her mother. The two streams of education, the boys and the girls, run on either side of the fire in the evenings of the year, and they produce, in due course, the next generation of men and women who will live in houses of this kind in glens the way that the present generation lives in them now. The fire, by this point, has reached the late phase of its evening's burning. The peats that were placed on the fire some time ago have by now become the deep red glowing mounds that the late evening fire produces, with their thin cores still hot, but their outer surfaces gradually whitening with ash. The man of the house, registering the state of the fire, gets up briefly and adds 2 more peats. The new peats sit on top of the older glowing peats, where they will, in the course of the next half hour or so, slowly catch fire and begin their own glow. The fire will, with these additions, hold its present level of warmth for the rest of the evening, until the time comes for the banking. The woman of the house has, while was attending to the fire, finished the spinning that she was going to do this evening. She has wound the last of the spun thread onto the spindle. She has, with the careful motion of a woman wrapping up a particular task, lifted the spindle and the distaff and set them together, with the bunch of remaining unspun wool still tied to the top of the distaff against the wall behind her stool. She will, Tomorrow evening, take them up again and continue. For tonight, the spinning is done. She does not immediately get up. She sits for a moment in the same position, with her hands on her knees, and looks at the fire. The position is the position of a person who has come to the natural end of one task and is, briefly, in the interval before deciding what the next task will be. She might at this point take up some other handwork. She might at this point begin to prepare for the bedding down. She might at this point simply sit and watch the fire for a few minutes longer before doing anything else. She has in her own internal accounting several options, and she is, in her own quiet way, considering them. She takes in the end the third option. She sits. She watches the fire. She does not, for several minutes, do anything at all. She is, in this interval, simply present in the room, in the way that we have been present in the room for the whole of the evening. The slow watching of the fire, which has been one of the particular things we have been doing on the bench, is now also, briefly, a thing that she is doing. The fire is, for a few minutes, the principal occupation of two of the people in the room. The man of the house has, after attending to the fire, gone back to his strap. He has made, in the course of the evening, considerable progress on it. The strap is now mostly finished. He is working on the final shaping of one end. He will, in the next few minutes, complete it, and he will then, by his own internal habit, set the leather tools away in their box and the strap aside and consider his evening's work done. The girl has, like her mother, reached the natural pause in her own work. She has finished the section of the stocking that she had set herself to do this evening. She has, with the careful motion of a knitter wrapping up, slipped the stitches off her needles and onto a wooden holder that will keep them in their proper position until the next time she takes up the work. She has set the partial stocking with its holder into the basket beside her mother's stool. She has folded her hands in her lap. She is now, like her mother, in the interval between tasks. The boy of 12, who has been talking with his father, has fallen silent. The conversation between them has reached its natural end. The boy is now, like the other young people in the room, in his own interval. He is, by the look of him, beginning to become tired. The long day on the hill is catching up with him. He will, in another short while, be ready for bed. The dog is asleep. The animals in the byre are quiet. The children behind the partition are asleep. The smaller boy who was carried to the bed earlier is asleep. The room, in this moment, is in a state of suspension. The work of the evening is done. The bedding down has not yet begun. The fire is burning. The wind is moving. The smoke is rising. The whole of the room is, in this interval, simply being itself. We are still on the bench. We have not moved for a long time. The plaid behind our back is still warm. The wood under us is still solid. The room, in its unhurried way, is preparing, by the slow accumulation of its intervals, to enter the last of its phases for the day. The fire is the centre. The wind is the surround. The slow handwork of the people in the room has at this point mostly stopped. The evening is the evening. We are still in the room while it all takes place. There is, in every Highland house at this season, a particular ritual that marks the transition from the evening to the night. The ritual is the banking of the fire. The banking has its own slow set of actions, and the woman of the house, who is the principal performer of the banking in this household, as in most households of the place, has been doing the banking on the evenings of her adult life since she was a young bride, and has by now the deep-settled competence with the operation that long practice produces. The woman's hands, when we have been able to watch them through the evening, have a particular quality of competence that is worth a moment's separate attention. The hands are not large. The hands are by some standards even small. The fingers are slim. The skin of the hands is rough at the surface, with the calluses and the thickenings that any working woman's hands accumulate, and the knuckles are slightly enlarged with the thickening that is the early sign of the joint complaint that the women of the place often develop in their later years from the cold and the wet of the constant outdoor work. The nails are short, kept short by the work itself, with the cracks and the lines that the constant immersion in cold water produces. The hands are not, in any conventional sense, beautiful. The hands are, however, in their own way, remarkable. The hands have learned, over the years of the woman's adult life, an extraordinary number of precise tasks. The spinning that we have watched them do is one of perhaps 50 precise crafts that the hands have mastered. The hands can knead bread, churn butter, milk a cow, knit a stocking, weave a length of plaid on the larger loom, mend a torn garment with stitches so they are nearly invisible, gut and clean a fish, salt a piece of meat, dig peats from the bog, plant seed potatoes in the plot behind the house, deliver a calf, lay out a body for burial. The hands have done between them all of these things on many occasions over many years, and the hands have, in their accumulated practice, become an instrument of the woman's working life that operates, on most occasions, faster than her conscious thought can direct it. When she is spinning, she is not thinking about the spinning. The hands, in their long-settled competence, simply do the work, while her conscious attention, freed by their competence, is somewhere else, on the thoughts of the day or on the considerations of the household or on the private parts of her own inner life that the work of the hands does not occupy. She has stood up from her stool. She has gone to a corner near the hearth where there is a heap of fine ash that she has been saving for the purpose. The ash is the product of many previous nights' fires, sifted carefully each morning when the hearth is cleaned and kept in a wooden bowl for use in the evening's banking. She picks up the bowl, she brings it to the hearth, she sets it down on the stones at the edge of the fire. She then takes from a peg on the wall an iron rake of a kind that the household keeps for this purpose. The rake is short, with a flat blade and a wooden handle. She uses the rake in a series of slow, careful movements to draw the still glowing peats together into a tight, close mound at the centre of the hearth. The peats, which during the evening have been spread out across the hearthstone for maximum warmth, are now consolidated into a dense pile that will, by the simple geometry of its consolidation, hold its heat far longer than the spread arrangement could. She then takes the bowl of ash. She begins, slowly and patiently, to sift the ash over the consolidated peats. The ash, falling on the glowing peats, dampens their surface glow without extinguishing the deep red core within each peat. The ash, when applied in sufficient quantity, forms a thick blanket that protects the peats from the air and that allows them to smoulder, in the absence of free oxygen, at a very slow rate that will keep them alive in some form until the morning. The technique is one of the oldest household techniques of the British Isles. The same technique, in its essentials, has been in use in households of this kind for longer than the houses themselves have existed. She continues to sift the ash until the peats are more or less completely covered. The bright red glow of the fire, which has been the principal light in the room for the whole evening, is now reduced to a dim glow that is visible only at the edges of the ash mound, where fragments of the underlying red are still showing through. The room, with the dimming of the fire, has become noticeably darker. The shadows on the walls and the ceiling, which had been moving in the unsteady firelight, have now settled into a deeper, steadier dimness. She sets the rake aside. She sets the empty ash bowl back in its corner. She stands for a moment beside the banked fire, considering her work. She has done this, by her own count, several thousand times. The work is, by long habit, automatic. The work, however, requires the final attention of a person who knows that the work must be done correctly, and who is checking, before she leaves it, that this evening's work is indeed correct. She nods slightly to herself. The fire is banked. The fire will hold. The man of the house, while the woman has been banking the fire, has finished his strap and put away his leather tools. He has stood up from the settle. He has gone to the door. He has, in the way of his evening's habit, lifted the heavy wooden bar that has been leaning against the wall and set it across the inside of the door, where it drops into the iron brackets on either side that hold it firm against the wind. The door is now for the night secured. No wind that the night is likely to bring will move the door against the bar. He has, having barred the door, gone to the byre. He has, with the lantern that he has lit from a coal of the still glowing fire, looked at the cow and the goat. He has spoken briefly to the cow in his low evening voice. He has spoken, more briefly, to the goat. He has examined, by the lantern's light, the bedding of straw and bracken at the floor of the byre, to make sure that there is enough of it for the animals to lie comfortably through the night. He has nodded. He has come back to the centre of the room, the lantern in his hand. He has not yet extinguished the lantern. The lantern is the portable light that the household will use briefly for the moving from the fire to the box bed and for the final tasks that the bedding down requires. The lantern is an iron frame with horn panes set into its sides, holding a clay bowl of fish oil with a wick of twisted rush, and the flame of the wick produces enough light in the dark room for the short distances that the household needs to cover. He hands the lantern to the woman of the house. She takes it. She goes with the lantern to the partition at the back. She passes through the opening in the partition. She looks at the children in their bed. The smaller boy who was carried there earlier is sleeping deeply. The two younger children, who have been in the bed since before we arrived, are sleeping also. She bends down in the space behind the partition and adjusts a corner of the blanket that has slipped off one of the smaller bodies. She stands up again. She looks at them for a moment. She comes back through the opening into the main part of the room. She gives the lantern back to the man of the house. He goes with it to the section of the room nearest the trestle, where the wash basin is. He waits there for a moment, with the lantern held high, while the woman of the house pours an amount of warm water from the kettle into the basin. He sets the lantern down on a shelf near the basin. He takes off his outer plaid. He folds it carefully, in the way the plaid is folded for the night, and he sets it on the bench beside the door, where it will be ready to be put on again in the morning. He removes his shirt belt. He bends over the basin and washes his face and his hands and his neck with the warm water and a piece of grey soap that the household has been making for itself from the rendered fat of the household's own animals and the ash fires. The soap, like everything else in the household, is the household's own work. When he has finished washing, he takes the piece of linen that the household uses for drying. He dries his face and his hands. He takes off his shirt. He puts on, from a peg above his head, a long undershirt of unbleached linen that he uses for sleeping. He goes, in the long undershirt, with the lantern in his hand, to the box bed at the back of the room. He pulls aside the heavy curtain. He sets the lantern down on a shelf inside the box. He gets into the bed. The woman of the house, while the man has been washing and changing, has been doing her own final tasks. She has gone to her stool one last time and put away the spindle, the distaff and the unspun wool into their basket, and set the basket against the wall. She has gone to the trestle and dismantled it for the night, leaning the top against the wall and setting the legs beside it. She has checked with a glance the various bowls and cups on the shelf to make sure they are in their places. She has gone to the wash basin, and after the man of the house has finished, she has used the same warm water for her own washing in the same slow, careful way. She, like the man, removes her outer plaid. She folds it. She sets it on top of his folded plaid on the bench beside the door. She removes her gown. She puts on in its place a long linen sleeping shift. She unpins her hair from beneath the white linen cap. She combs the hair briefly with a wooden comb that she takes from a peg on the wall. She braids the hair in the simple braid that she wears for sleeping. She pins the cap back on in the looser way that the cap is worn through the night. She picks up the lantern, which the man of the house has left on the shelf inside the box bed. She brings it briefly into the center of the room. She holds the lantern high. She looks around the room in a slow, careful sweep, the way the woman of the house looks around her room before she goes to bed at the end of the day. She is checking, as her last task of the evening, that everything is in its place, that no fire is burning where it should not be, that no animal has got out of its place, that no door is standing open that should be closed. The check is the daily reassurance that the house is in its various ways in order for the night. The check satisfies her. She nods, slightly, to herself. She turns with the lantern and walks toward the box bed. The girl, the older boy, and the boy of 12 have, while the parents have been doing their bedding down preparations, been doing their own. The girl has gone to a recess beside the children's bed, where she has changed into her own sleeping shift and combed her own hair and braided it. She has by now slipped into the children's bed beside the smaller children who have not stirred. The older boy has, similarly, prepared himself for the night in his own private way and has lain down on his own narrow bed, which is on the opposite side of the partition from the children's bed and which holds on most nights only him. The boy of 12 has done the same on a similar narrow bed close to his older brothers. The household, in its succession of preparations, has now placed itself in its various sleeping positions. The woman of the house carries the lantern to the box bed. She steps inside. She pulls the heavy wool curtain across the open side of the box. The curtain, when fully drawn, encloses the bed and the two adults inside it in a dark, warm space that is now, in effect, separated from the rest of the room by the thick wool. The lantern which she has set inside the box bed for the moment gives a dim glow from behind the curtain, visible from the room only as a faint horizontal line at the bottom of the wool where the curtain does not quite reach the floor. She speaks briefly in a low voice to the man of the house, the words of a wife to her husband at the end of the day. He responds in the same low voice. The exchange is the exchange of a couple who have been together for a long time and who have, on many evenings of their long marriage, exchanged similar words at this same hour. The woman of the house, having said what she wanted to say, lifts the lantern. She blows out the wick. The flame is extinguished. The thin horizontal line of light at the bottom of the curtain disappears. The room is now, except for the banked glow at the edges of the fire, fully dark. The eyes have to adjust. The darkness, however, is not absolute. The remaining glow of the banked fire still casts, against the walls and the ceiling, a very faint reddish tint that the adapting eye, after a minute or two, begins to register. The room in this very faint glow is still, in its general outlines, visible. The shapes of the chest, the trestle leaning against the wall, the partition at the back, the bier at the door end, the dark mound of the banked fire in the centre, can still be seen by the eyes that have over the next 2 or 3 minutes completed their adjustment. We are still on the bench. We have not moved. The plaid is still warm behind our back. The wood is still solid under us. We have, by the accumulation of the evening's events, become so much a fixture of the room that the household, in its bedding down preparations, has not, on the whole, particularly attended to us. We are, in this house, what we have been since we came in. We are present. We are accepted. We are part of the room. The room, having reached its full settling, has now become, in its sound, very different from the room we have been in for the previous several hours. The sound of the room, while the household was awake, was the sound of the fire, spinning, knitting needles, leather tools, conversations, and the singing and the storytelling. The sound of the room, now that the household is in its sleeping positions, is the sound of breathing. The sound of breathing in a room of this kind with this number of sleeping bodies in it is a soft layered sound that the ear gradually learns to hear. There are, by our count, 8 breaths in the room. There are the breaths of the man of the house and the woman of the house behind the curtain of the box bed. There are the breaths of the older boy and the boy of 12 in their narrow beds. There are the breaths of the girl and the smaller boy, and the two younger children in the children's bed. There is the breath of the dog in his hollow. The breaths are at slightly different rates and at slightly different depths, and the 8 rhythms together produce, in the air of the room, a soft layered hum that is, in its own way, as constant as the wind outside. The dog has been asleep for most of the evening. The dog, at this point, is not far from the deepest part of his night's sleep, and his breathing has the quality of breathing that has reached its nighttime floor. The smaller children are breathing in the high, fast breaths that sleeping children produce. Their breaths are not always quite even. There are, in their breathing, the irregularities of sleeping bodies that are still, at their age, working out the adjustments that sleep requires. The girl and the older boy are breathing in the slower, deeper rhythms of older sleeping children. Their breaths are mostly even. The girl occasionally makes a sound in her sleep, the half-formed word that sleeping children sometimes produce, but the sound is not, on the whole, repeated, and she is not, by all evidence, dreaming in any way that disturbs her. The man of the house and the woman of the house are breathing behind their curtain in the rhythms that we cannot quite hear over the distance. But the small, soft sound that comes through the wool of the curtain is the sound of 2 adults settling into the early stages of their sleep. The animals in the byre are quiet. The cow's breathing, which is slower and deeper than any of the human breaths, is just audible from her position behind the screen. The goat's breathing is too faint to hear. The kid is asleep against the goat's side. The wind outside is the surround. The wind has, in the last little while, dropped slightly. The note in the corners is now at its lowest level since we came in. The irregular gusts have for the moment ceased. The wind is, at this hour, the kind of wind that simply moves in a slow, steady way around the outside of the building. The fire is the centre. The deep red core of the consolidated peats is still alive. The deep red core will, through the long hours of the night, slowly continue to smoulder. The deep red core will, in the morning, when the woman of the house comes to it with kindling and dry fragments of peat, be ready to flare back into life and begin the new day's burning. This is the room at the deepest middle of its evening. This is what the room becomes when all of its daily activities have, in their succession of completions, been completed. The night, in its long, deep middle, passes slowly. We are still on the bench. We have not, in the time since the household went to bed, moved. The plaid is still around our shoulders. The bench is still solid under us. The room is still in its very faint reddish dimness, which, as the banked fire slowly progresses through its slow night burning, gradually becomes fainter still. Time, in the night, does not move at the rate at which time moves during the day. Time, in the night, has a different quality. The hours pass in long, slow cycles that the body, lying or sitting still, does not register at the resolution it registers daytime time. The breathing of the room continues, the wind continues, the fire continues, in its very slow way, to smoulder. There is, for some considerable interval, no other change in the room. We become gradually aware of variations within the larger constancy. The variations are very small. The fire, after some time, gives off a faint popping sound as a pocket of moisture in one of the deeper peats releases its steam through the ash above. The pop is brief. The pop is followed by a renewed silence, and then by the resumption of the soft-layered breathing. The cow, in the byre, shifts her weight, with a sound of straw rustling under her hooves, and resumes her standing rest. The goat, who had been lying down, briefly stands up, walks one step to the side, and lies down again. The smaller boy in the children's bed makes a soft sound in his sleep, and then is silent. These variations are the night's events. The night has no other events. The night, in this place, at this season, at this hour, is simply the long, slow passage of the breath of the household, and the wind outside and the slow burning of the banked fire, with the variations contributing by their very rarity, the only punctuations that the night provides. The wind, after some time, begins to bring rain. The rain, when it begins, is not announced by any sudden shift in the wind. The rain simply, gradually, becomes audible as a steady patter on the thatch above the room. The patter is soft. The patter is even. The patter has in its sound the monotonous regularity that a steady night rain on a thatched roof produces. The rain at this level will not soak through the thatch. The thatch, properly laid and properly maintained, holds against rain of this kind without difficulty. The water, falling on the heather of the thatch, runs off down the slopes of the roof and falls from the eaves onto the wet ground around the house. The sound of the rain on the thatch is a sound that the household in its sleep finds reassuring rather than disturbing. The rain on the thatch is the confirming evidence that the thatch is doing its work. The thatch, when properly laid, sheds rain. The rain runs over the surface of the heather, follows the natural channels that the layered heather creates, and falls in steady streams from the lower edge of the eaves into the wet ground a few inches outside the wall. The water, falling on the ground, makes its own additional sound, a soft patter that is just audible from inside the building if the listener is paying attention. The two sounds together, the patter on the thatch above and ground below, make a kind of soft acoustic envelope around the building, with the building, dry inside, sitting in the center of it. The household, listening in its sleep, registers the envelope as the reassuring sound of the building functioning. The building is keeping out the wet. The household is keeping in the warmth. The night with its weather is being met by the building in the competent way that the building has been meeting nights of this kind for as long as it has stood. The household in its sleep can rest more deeply for the reassurance that the rain on the thatch provides. The rain, in this sense, is not an interruption of the household's rest. The rain is, in its own way, a contribution to it. The rain has been doing this on the same thatch, on the same slope, on the same hill, on many nights, and the rain will continue to do it on many nights more. And the acoustic confirmation that the building is, on this particular night, doing its job, is the steady accompaniment under which the household sleeps deeper. The rain becomes, after a while, a slightly fuller rain. The patter becomes a slightly more emphatic patter. The sound in the room has now another layer to it. There is the breathing, there is the wind, there is the rain. The three together produce, in the dark room, a kind of soft acoustic blanket that wraps the sleeping household in the protective sound of the building enduring, as it has endured many nights, the steady weather of its place. The household does not wake. The household has, on many previous nights, slept through similar rain. The household will, on many future nights, sleep through similar rain. The rain is part of the climate of the place. The household, by its long habituation, registers the rain in its sleep only at the level of a confirming presence, not an interruption. The rain continues at its steady level for some time. The wind with the rain rises and falls in unpredictable variations, sometimes dropping back to the soft note we have heard most of the evening, sometimes lifting briefly into a slightly stronger note that pushes the rain harder against the windward side of the building. The thatch on the windward side has been slightly thicker than the thatch on the leeward side, because the thatcher who laid it many years ago understood the prevailing wind and laid the thatch to counter it. The thatch holds. The rain runs off. The room inside remains dry. Some time later, the rain begins to thin. The patter on the thatch, which had become slightly more emphatic, begins to soften again. Within the space of perhaps a quarter of an hour, the patter returns to the lighter level it had when the rain began, and a little while after that, the patter ceases altogether. The wind, after the rain has stopped, continues for a time at its slightly elevated level, and then, gradually drops back to the soft, steady note that was its level earlier in the evening. The night, having had its weather, returns to its quiet, deep middle of the night. In this place at this season is a long thing. The hours between the bedding down and the first signs of dawn are perhaps 8 or 9 hours at this latitude in the autumn, and the household, asleep through the whole of this interval, will not wake until the first light begins to come, very faintly, through the high window with its oiled cloth. We, on the bench, do not sleep. We have come to the room as visitors, and as visitors we are not bound by the household's rhythms in the way that the household itself is bound. We are, in some sense, outside the household's time. We can stay in the room in our position for as long as the night requires us to stay, and we will register, in the room, the slow passage of the hours that the sleeping household, in its sleep, does not register. The fire, in its banked state, has continued through the night to do its slow smouldering work. The deep red core of the consolidated peats is still alive. The ash blanket over them has, in the course of the night, accumulated slightly as the surface burning of the peats has produced new fine ash. The fire, taken altogether, is now in the deepest phase of its night-long endurance. There is still life in it. The warmth in the room, although it has dropped considerably from the warmth of the fully burning fire of the early evening, has not dropped to the cold of the outside air. The thick stone walls of the building, the thatched roof, the closeness of the household's bodies, the body warmth of the animals at the byre end, the steady heat of the banked fire, all of these together have kept the room at a temperature that the household, in its sleeping positions under its various plaids and blankets, finds comfortable. The wind in the deepest middle of the night drops to its lowest level. The wind at this hour is barely audible. The note in the corners has fallen below the threshold at which the ear normally registers it, and only when the ear is consciously listening for the wind can the wind still be heard. The world outside the building is, at this hour, almost completely silent. The burn, outside the house, has been making its steady sound under everything that the evening has produced. The burn has been making the sound, more or less, since long before the house was built, and the burn will continue to make the sound more or less long after the house has fallen down. The water in the burn at this hour is the cold water of an autumn night, with the additional cold of the rain that has fallen earlier in the day, and the burn is by its level slightly higher than its summer level, with an additional volume that the day's rain has contributed. The water moves over the stones of the burn's bed in the steady way that water in burns of this kind moves. The movement produces, against the stones, the sound that we noticed when we first arrived. The sound has been there throughout the evening. The sound is there now. The sound will be there in the morning. The household, which has been listening to the sound of the burn since the household was first established in this house, has stopped registering the sound at the level of conscious noticing, but the sound is, in some deeper sense, part of the household's working acoustic environment, and the household, on the infrequent occasions on which it travels to a place where the sound of a burn is not present, finds the absence of the sound briefly disconcerting before the household, in the new place, accommodates itself to whatever the new place sounds like. The burn, in its steady way, is one of the deepest features of the place. The burn, like the wind, like the smell of the peat smoke, like the constant low sounds of the animals in the byre, is part of the acoustic and sensory texture that makes this particular place rather than some other particular place.
The household has been, for the whole of its members' lives, in this texture. The household will, by the most likely projection, continue to be in this texture for the foreseeable future. The texture is the place is the home.
There is occasionally in the silence a distant sound. The sound is, by its character, the sound of an owl somewhere on the upper part of the hill, calling once in the low call that the owls of the place produce, and falling silent again. The owl is a long way off. The call, when it reaches the building, is faint. The household asleep does not register the call. The dog, in his sleep, may register it at some level, but does not wake. The owl, after the single call, is silent for a long time. Some considerable interval later, perhaps half an hour, the owl calls again, in the same low single note, from approximately the same place on the hill. The two calls are the only calls the owl makes in the course of the night. The owl is, by the season of the year, in the early part of its winter range, and the calls, which are part of its territorial maintenance, are made at the intervals that the owl, in its own life, requires. There is, somewhere on the lower part of the hill, also briefly, the distant sound of a deer moving through the bracken. The deer, by the sound of the movement, is a single animal, perhaps a young stag or a hind without a calf, walking slowly and pausing occasionally in the unhurried way of deer at night. The sound of the deer's movement, like the call of the owl, does not reach the building at any volume that would wake the sleeping household. The sound is, however, present in the larger acoustic space of the glen, and we, with our slightly different position as visitors who are not fully part of the household's sleeping rhythm, register the sound briefly before it passes. The deer in due course moves out of hearing. The owl in due course ceases its calling. The night, having had its weather and its distant animals, returns to the deeper quiet that is its principal note. The hill behind the settlement is silent. The burn, which has been making its steady sound all evening, has continued through the night and is still making it, but the sound of the burn, against the silence of the rest of the night, is faint enough that we are not always sure we are still hearing it. The breathing of the household, in the deepest middle of the night, has settled into its lowest, steadiest rhythms. The breaths, 8 of them, are now nearly synchronized in their general level, although each is at its own slightly different rate. The total sound of the breathing in the dark room is the soft, layered sound that we noticed when the household first went to sleep, but it is now slightly softer, slightly more even, slightly more deeply settled. This is the breath of the deepest night. This is the breath of bodies that have for several hours been under, and that will for several hours more continue to be under. The dog occasionally twitches. The dog is dreaming, in the way of dogs, of something that involves running movements. The twitches are very small. The twitches do not disturb the dog's breathing. The twitches pass after a moment, and the dog returns to his deeper rest. The girl at one point turns over in the children's bed. The turning is slow. The turning does not wake any of the smaller children beside her. She settles in her new position into the same deep breathing as before. The turning passes. These are the only events of the deepest middle of the night. Many hours pass. The fire in its banked state continues to hold. The wind, having dropped to its lowest level, has held there for some hours. The breathing of the household, having settled into its deepest rhythms, has held there for the same hours. The room, taken all together, has been in its quietest state for what feels like a very long time, although the movements of the air, and the variations of the sound of the breathing, and the slow burning of the deep core of the banked fire have continued, in their own slow way, to mark the passage of time. The first sign of the change is, eventually, in the high window with its oiled cloth. The cloth, which through the night has been a dark square against the slightly less dark stone of the wall, has now, in the slow, imperceptible way of the eyes registering the very smallest of changes, become a slightly less dark square. The change is so small that the eye, when it first notices it, is not sure whether the change is real, or whether the eye is in the long looking at the dark, beginning to imagine variations that are not there. The change continues, very slowly, over the next considerable interval. The cloth, which was very dark, is now slightly less dark. The cloth, after another long interval, is slightly less dark again. The dawn is coming. The dawn, in this place at this season, comes very slowly. The first signs of the dawn are small and gradual, and the full daylight is many hours away. But the first signs are now, in their very small way, present. The window, very slowly, is becoming visible against the wall. The whole room, as the dawn comes, will, over the next hour or two, gradually emerge from its night darkness into its dim morning grey, in the same slow, patient way that the room has done at this season, at this hour, for as long as the room has existed. The fire, in its banked state, will hold until the woman of the house comes to it in the morning. The household, in its sleeping positions, will hold its sleep for some time yet. The cow will at some point soon begin to make the small low sounds that mean she is ready to be milked. The dog will, at some point soon, lift his head and look around and confirm that the room is in the morning state, and will lie down again until someone calls him. The household, when it begins to wake, will wake slowly in the same slow, patient way that everything else in this room happens. The waking will be in its small succession of stretches and turnings and small soft yawns, the small reverse of the bedding down we watched some hours ago, and the household will, in its waking, begin the small slow work of the new day. The household has been here, in this house, for as long as any member of the household can remember. The household will, by the most likely projection, continue to be here. The fire banked tonight will be raised again in the morning by the woman of the house, and the kettle with fresh water will be set on the chain again, and the smoke will rise again, and the small daily work of the household, in its long, unbroken way, will resume. But that is for later. That is a different evening. That is not what we have come for. We have come for the long, slow evening. We continue to sit. The bench continues to hold us. The plaid behind our back continues to give us its small, accumulated warmth. The room, in its small, steady way, continues to be the room. The night, in its long, slow way, continues to be the night. The household, in its various sleeping positions, continues to breathe its layered breath. The fire, under its blanket of ash, continues to hold its small living core. The wind around the outside continues to move at its lowest level. The burn, beyond the wind, continues to make its small, steady sound. All of these things together are what we came for. All of these things together are what the room on this evening is. The evening has been the evening of any ordinary Highland house in this glen at this season, at this hour, with the ordinary fire and the ordinary food and the ordinary small handwork conversation and the ordinary slow turning toward the night. The evening has been, in its small unhurried way, the evening that this household has had on most evenings of the year for many years, and that the household will continue to have on most evenings of the year for many years more. The room, in its long, quiet way, has held us. The bench under us has held us. The plaid behind our back has held us. The fire, in its various phases through the long evening, has been the centre that the room has organised itself around. The wind, in its small variations, has been the surround. The small, slow handwork of the household, the spinning and the weaving and the knitting and the leather work, has been the texture between the centre and the surround. The food has been eaten. The small stories have been told. The small songs have been sung. The household has gone, in its small succession, to its sleeping places. The fire has been banked. The night has come down. The deepest middle of the night has passed. The first faint signs of the slow dawn are now in the small high window. The evening has ended. We do not need to leave. The room will continue. The morning will come. The new day will begin. The fire, brought back from its banked state, will burn again in the centre of the room. The kettle, with fresh water, will be set on the chain. The smoke will rise again. The wind will continue, in its small variations, to move around the outside of the walls. The whole long, slow rhythm of the place will, in its long, unbroken way, continue. The room, in its long life, has held, before this evening, a great many evenings of the same general kind. The room has held the evening that the man of the house's father had on the evening before he went into the snow. The room has held the evening on which the smaller of the children behind the partition was born, in the box bed where the man of the house and the woman of the house are now asleep, with House's mother, who came over from the neighbouring glen for the birth, attending. The room has held the evening on which the man of the house's grandmother, who had been the woman of the house in her own time, lay dying in the same box bed, surrounded by the family she had raised, with a small banked fire in the hearth, and the small, soft layered sound of the breathing of the people gathered around her. The room has held many evenings of small ordinary work and small ordinary conversation, with no event in particular to mark them, that have, in their long accumulation, been the principal substance of what the building has been used for. The room, in its small long memory, holds the marks of all of these evenings. The marks are not, in any visible sense, present in the room. The walls do not record them. The hearth does not record them. But the room, in some sense that is harder to describe, has been shaped by them. The room is what it is, partly because of what has happened in it, and the people who have lived in it, including the present household, have, in their daily life, been moving through a space that is partly built up of what was done by the people who lived in it before. The texture of the room, in this small sense, is older than the present household. The texture of the room will, when the present household is gone and a new household has come into the building, still be there, in the same small accumulated form, contributing the same small old presence to the new evenings that will in due course be lived in the same room. We have, on our bench, watched what we came to watch. We have, by sitting still, taken the room into ourselves. The smell of the peat smoke is in our clothes and in our hair. The small, soft, layered sound of the breathing household is in our ears. The slow, dim red glow of the banked fire is at the back of our eyes when we close them. The whole of the place, in its small, unhurried way, has done what the place does on the evenings of its long life, and we have been there for it. Sleep well. The fire is banked. The household is asleep. The wind is moving softly around the walls. The dawn is, very slowly, on its way. The room, in its long, quiet way, holds. The story, in the small, unhurried way of the houses that know how to keep their stories, goes on. Good night.